On the evening of March 27, 2002, at a charity fashion show in St Andrews, Scotland, a 20-year-old student named Kate Middleton walked down a makeshift runway in a sheer black dress over a strapless bandeau, and the 19-year-old Prince of Wales, sitting in the front row, paid £200 for a ticket he had not originally planned to buy, leaned over to his friend Fergus Boyd, and said something that Boyd has repeated in various forms ever since. What he said was, "Wow, Kate's hot." What nobody at the show was supposed to know, and what has since been reconstructed from the accounts of the people involved, was how precisely the evening had been arranged. The dress had been designed for the show, the front row ticket had been acquired, the seating had been managed, and the girl in the dress had, by the account of Tina Brown's 2022 biography drawing on Palace Insiders, been placed at the centre of Prince William's social world through a sequence of decisions that began not at St Andrews but years earlier, in a house in Berkshire, at a kitchen table, where a woman who had once announced flight departures for British Airways was thinking several moves ahead on a chessboard the other players had not yet seen. The woman was Carole Middleton, and what she had understood, before almost anyone else in the room understood it, was that the game was winnable. Here is what the palace knew from day one, and never said publicly. When the courtiers who vetted the Middleton family in the years before the engagement ran their assessment, they found not the wholesome middle-class family the press was describing, but something that made the older members of the household reach for words they chose carefully. The word that circulated in the accounts of people inside those conversations that later reached the biographers was ruthless. Not ambitious, not strategic, ruthless. The distinction mattered to the people making it, because ambition is a quality the institution has always accommodated in the people who marry into it, and ruthlessness is something else, something that the institution recognized from its own reflection and found uncomfortable when it saw it from outside. What the ruthlessness produced, across 20 years of the most watched courtship in the world, was the Princess of Wales. What it cost, in the people and the decisions and the financial wreckage it generated along the way, is what almost nobody has assembled into a single account, because the individual pieces have been reported in isolation, in different newspapers across different years, and the isolation prevented the pattern from becoming visible. The pattern is what this account assembles. It includes a business that collapsed owing £2.5 million at the exact moment its founder's daughter was fighting cancer, and the palace needed the story to go away. It includes a younger sister whose entire public identity became a problem the palace managed for a decade. It includes a brother whose business failures produced the specific variety of tabloid coverage that royal families pay communications teams to prevent, and whose mental health disclosures, however genuine, arrived in the press at moments of convenient counter-narrative. It includes elocution lessons the palace has never denied. A university switch that put a future princess in a future king's lecture hall. A fashion show with a transparent dress and a front-row ticket, and running through all of it, the fingerprints that Tina Brown identified on Kate's first move on the royal chessboard, belonging to the woman in the Berkshire kitchen, who was thinking several moves ahead. This account is not the story of a family who got lucky. It is the story of a family who decided, at a specific moment, that luck was insufficient, and that sufficiency required a plan. The plan worked. The working of it is what the following parts examine, from the coal mines of County Durham where Carole Goldsmith's family began, to the Berkshire kitchen where she designed the ascent, to the throne room where her daughter will one day sit, to the administrator's office where the company she built to fund it all was handed to creditors owing more than it was worth. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The marriage that produced the Princess of Wales began at 30,000 feet, between a flight attendant and a flight dispatcher, on routes that British Airways operated out of Heathrow in the late 1970s. The detail has been repeated so often in the profiles and the supplements and the official accounts of the Middleton family that it has passed from a fact into a kind of founding myth, the wholesome origin story of two airline employees who fell in love and built a business and raised a princess. The myth is not false. It is incomplete in the way that founding myths are always incomplete, which is that it describes the surface of the meeting without examining what each person brought to it, and what they brought on examination, turns out to be substantially different, and the difference is the map of everything that followed. Carole Elizabeth Goldsmith was born on the 31st of January 1955 at Perivale Maternity Hospital in West London, the elder of two children of Ronald John James Goldsmith and Dorothy Ann Goldsmith, née Harrison. Ronald was a craftsman decorator, self-employed, mild-mannered by the accounts of people who knew him, the kind of working man whose dignity resided in his trade rather than in any institutional position. Dorothy worked part-time as a sales assistant in a jewelry shop, and the accounts of the family's circumstances in those early years describe a household organized around the specific discipline of people who are careful with money, because money requires carefulness. The family lived first in council housing in Ealing, then moved to a small terraced house in Southall, West London, and Carole attended Featherstone High School, a state comprehensive, where she received the education that the state provided to the children of working families in West London in the 1960s and 1970s, which was adequate in its way and not designed to produce aristocrats. Her maternal great-grandfather, John Harrison, born in 1874, worked the coal seams of County Durham, one of the hundreds of thousands of men whose labour powered the industrial economy of northern England, at a time when the men who owned the mines lived in a different England from the men who worked them. Harrison never left Durham. His granddaughter Dorothy left it for London, as many young working-class women did in the post-war decades, and found work and found Ronald and produced Carole, and the trajectory from Durham Pit to Perivale Maternity Hospital to Featherstone High School is a trajectory the 20th century produced in its thousands, the specific story of a working-class family moving toward the middle of the century's expanding middle class, making the move one generation at a time, through the specific combination of work and carefulness and the willingness to leave behind the geography that had defined the preceding generation. Michael Francis Middleton was born on the 23rd of June 1949 in Leeds, West Riding of Yorkshire, the son of Captain Peter Francis Middleton and Valerie Middleton, née Glassborough, and his family's trajectory out of Leeds was a different kind of trajectory from a different kind of start. The Middleton family's connection to the Lupton dynasty of Yorkshire, documented in the genealogical research that royal correspondents conducted after the 2011 wedding, is not the connection of a distant branch or an honorary association. Michael's grandmother was Olive Christiana Lupton, educated at Roedean School and accepted at the University of Cambridge, member of a family whose men had served as Lord Mayor of Leeds twice over, whose family seat was Beechwood, a Georgian mansion in Roundhay, on the outskirts of the city, and whose social world, in the decades when Olive was growing up and marrying and establishing herself, included the regular company of Princess Mary, sister of both Edward Vine and George VI, and her husband Henry Lascelles, the 6th Earl of Harewood. The Luptons and the Middletons rode with the Bramham Moor Hunt alongside the princess. Their portraits were painted by the same society artist who painted the royal family. Olive Middleton stood in the procession of dignitaries that accompanied Princess Mary through Headingley in 1927, and the photograph of that occasion, discovered by an Australian historian decades later and published in the Mail on Sunday in 2021, shows exactly what the Middleton family's position was before Michael ever boarded a plane or met a flight attendant. It was the position of people who had been in the proximity of royalty for generations, through the specific mechanism of Yorkshire land, wool money, civic prominence, and the social connections that those things generate across time. Olive's fortune, accumulated from the Lupton family's commercial and professional success across the 19th century, was settled in trust funds that passed to Michael's branch of the family, and that the Middleton family's subsequent accounts acknowledge as a material component of the resources that made the family what it became. Michael was educated at Clifton College in Bristol, one of the country's established private schools, which is where the sons of families of his grandmother's background were sent, and subsequently at the University of Surrey. He joined British Airways as a flight dispatcher, a professional role organized around the management of aircraft operations, and he encountered Carole Goldsmith in the specific context of a workplace where a man with a private school education and a family trust fund and a grandmother who had stood in processions alongside princesses worked alongside a woman from Southall whose great-grandfather had worked Durham coal seams. They married on the 21st of June 1980 at the Church of St. James in Dorney, Buckinghamshire, and the marriage joined, in the specific manner that English marriages have always joined, two different social positions into a single household, and the household that resulted was the household that would produce, 9 years later, the strategy that this account examines. But to understand the strategy, the asymmetry of the marriage requires a moment's attention, because the asymmetry is the engine of everything. Michael brought to the marriage what men of his background bring: the connection, the credential, the specific social ease of someone who has grown up knowing that the world's institutions are organized by people like him and for people like him, and who navigates those institutions with the fluency that private schooling and inherited position produce. He brought the trust funds and the Lupton name, and the Yorkshire network, and the grandmother who had ridden with Princess Mary, though by 1980, those things were historical rather than operational, background rather than foreground. Carole brought something different. She brought the specific quality of attention that a working-class upbringing in West London develops in people who are intelligent and observant, and who have grown up understanding that the institutions around them were not designed by people like them, and have learned, in consequence, to read those institutions with a precision that their natural members never need to develop. She had watched, from outside the window, and the watching had given her an understanding of what was on the other side of the glass that the people inside the room did not themselves possess. She also brought, by the accounts of every person who has described her in the years since her daughter became famous, a specific quality of determination that the genteel vocabulary of the profiles she later attracted kept describing as ambition, and that the people who observed her in action reached for harder words for. The word that circulated in palace circles, as already established in this account's opening pages, was ruthless. The word requires its context before it requires its verdict, and the context is the context of a woman who had understood from childhood that the distance between Southall and the places she saw around her was a distance that did not close itself, that required a plan, and who had the intelligence and the patience to make one. Party pieces began in 1987 in the Middletons' home in the village of Bradfield Southend in Berkshire, where the family had moved after Michael left British Airways to join a company called Keith Prowse, the entertainment ticket agency. The business started as a response to a specific domestic observation. Children's parties required supplies that were not easily available through ordinary retail channels, and a mail-order company that provided them would serve a market that nobody was yet serving in the organized form Carole envisioned. Kate, then 5 years old, had inspired the idea through her birthday party, and Kate and her siblings would work for the company across their childhoods, Pippa writing the blog, James making cakes, Kate developing the birthday and baby category. The business, a family operation in every sense, grew through the 1990s into a company that the trade press estimated at £30 million by the early 2000s, built on the same qualities that Carole brought to everything: close attention to what people wanted, exact management of what was provided, and a specific intolerance for the gap between the two. The money it produced funded the next stage of the social climb, and the social climb had been running in parallel with the business from the beginning. The children were sent to St. Andrew's School, Pangbourne, the private preparatory school from which the daughters would proceed to Down House, the girls' boarding school in Cold Ash, Berkshire, and then to Marlborough College in Wiltshire. The schools represented, in the specific geography of English private education, a significant investment and a significant statement. These were not the schools of the merely successful middle class, of the professional families who spent their money on tennis lessons and holidays. They were the schools of the aspirant upper middle class, the schools from whose playing fields and common rooms the networks of English establishment life were formed and maintained, the schools that Carole and Michael had not themselves attended, but that they were determined their children would. What Carole understood, and what the school choices reflected, was that the English class system is not a barrier to be broken through, but a ladder to be climbed, and that the ladder's rungs are specific and sequential, and require the right credential at each stage before the next stage becomes accessible. State School in Southall had been her credential. Featherstone High School had been what the state provided. It had not provided what the next generation required. and the next generation would not be left with what the state provided, and the school fees were the specific investment that converted the party piece's revenue into the social capital that the party piece's revenue alone could not purchase. The Bucklebury House came in 1995, a large family home in the Berkshire village that would become, across the following decades, the backdrop against which the Middleton family's public image was constructed, the English country house setting that the press photographers reached for when they needed an image that said established, settled, belonging, the specific vocabulary of arrival that Carole had been building toward since the Southall terraced house and the State Comprehensive and the British Airways uniform. She had travelled, in 40 years, from John Harrison's Durham pit to a Berkshire village with a church and a manor house and a daughter who was, by the mid-1990s, attending one of England's most prestigious girls' schools in the company of the daughters of the people whose company Carole had spent her adult life learning how to enter. Kate began at Down House in 1995, at 13, and did not thrive. The school's culture, organized around the social hierarchies of girls who had known each other since prep school, whose parents knew each other from the same networks, whose social ease was the product of a formation that Kate had not yet fully received, produced in her the specific experience of the newcomer who has arrived at the right address but has not yet mastered the language spoken there. She was bullied, she was unhappy, she left after 2 terms. Carole removed her, enrolled her at Marlborough College instead, and the second school proved, by the accounts of Kate's contemporaries there, a different environment, one whose slightly broader intake and slightly less concentrated social hierarchy gave her the space to find her formation. She thrived at Marlborough. By the time she left for a gap year, she was the person she would need to be for the next stage. The next stage was the university, and the university was not yet decided when Kate's gap year began in 2000. It would be decided by accounts that Tina Brown organized in the Palace Papers and that Omid Scobie corroborated in Endgame in a manner that left Carole's fingerprints on every surface it touched. Kate had been accepted at the University of Edinburgh. Edinburgh was an excellent university, a socially credible choice, the choice of exactly the kind of well-educated Marlborough College leaver that Kate had become. It was not the University of St Andrews. And St Andrews, in the autumn of 2000, was where Prince William had decided to go. In the autumn of 2000, a 19-year-old named Catherine Middleton began a gap year that the official account of her life has always described in the wholesome vocabulary that gap years attract when they belong to people who later become famous: the Florence Art Course, the Raleigh International Expedition to Chile, the personal growth, the broadening horizons. The description is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not describe is what else was happening during the same months, in the background of the year, in the conversations between a mother and a daughter in a Berkshire house, about a decision that would need to be made before the year ended. Kate had been accepted at the University of Edinburgh. She had applied, been offered a place, and by the conventional logic of a Marlborough College leaver, with good A-levels and a sensible head, Edinburgh was the natural next step, a prestigious Russell Group university, socially credible, academically serious, the choice that several of her Marlborough contemporaries were also making. The choice had one specific quality that the conventional logic did not weigh. It was not the choice that Prince William was making. William's university decision had been public since June 2000, when the palace announced that the heir to the throne would be attending the University of St Andrews in Fife, beginning in the autumn of 2001. The announcement was widely covered. It was the kind of royal news that the press notes and files and moves on from, because a prince's university choice is a piece of information rather than a story. It became a story, in retrospect, when the person sitting next to him in art history turned out to be someone who had been accepted at a different university, taken a gap year, and made a specific decision during that year to change her plans. Tina Brown, drawing on Palace insiders for the Palace Papers published in 2022, wrote the sentence that no official account of the Middleton family has ever directly contradicted. Carole's fingerprints are all over Kate's first move on the royal chessboard. The move was the switch from Edinburgh to St Andrews. The fingerprints were, in Brown's account and in the corroborating account that Omid Scobie assembled for Endgame in 2023, the specific practical interventions that preceded the switch, the conversations that identified St. Andrews as the university William had chosen, the assessment of what that choice represented in terms of proximity and opportunity, and the decision that Edinburgh, for all its merits, was the wrong address. The gap year served a specific function beyond the cultural enrichment the official account describes. It provided the time in which the switch could be made without its logic being visible. A student who applies to Edinburgh, gets in, and immediately reapplies to St. Andrews, raises questions that a student who applies to Edinburgh, spends a gap year in Florence and Chile, and then reapplies to St. Andrews, does not, because the gap year supplies the narrative of the person who changed her mind after a period of reflection, and the narrative of a person who changed her mind after reflection is a narrative about the person's development, rather than about the person's target. Carole Middleton had elocution lessons arranged for Kate during or around the same period. The palace has never denied this, and its non-denial is the specific form of confirmation that institutions apply to facts they cannot disprove and prefer not to confirm. When the claim was reported, the palace's communications operation said nothing about it. Kate's vows at St. Andrews, by the accounts of people who knew her there, were the vows of someone who had worked on her vows, the specific neutralization of regional and class markers that British elocution addresses when the person paying for the lessons understands what the lessons are actually for. The understanding, in this case, was the understanding of a woman who had grown up in Southall, knowing that the way you spoke was the first thing the room heard and the first credential the room assessed, and who had spent 30 years developing the social accent that covered her origins, and who was now ensuring that her daughter's origins would be covered before they needed to be. Kate arrived at St. Andrews in the autumn of 2001 to read History of Art. The choice of subject has attracted commentary that ranges from the dismissive, a soft subject for a girl who wanted to meet a prince, to the defensive, a genuine intellectual interest, developed through the Florence art course, and through the visual sensibility that her upbringing in a family with aesthetic ambitions had cultivated. The truth available in the record is somewhere between the positions, but the positions miss the point that the record most clearly establishes, which is that the subject was shared with another first-year student in the same department, who had also chosen History of Art, and who sat in the same lectures and attended the same seminars, and who was, for the first half of his first year, one of the most recognized young men on earth trying to be a student. William's arrival at St. Andrews had been managed by the palace, with the specific care that a sovereign's heir requires when he enters a public institution for the first time. The press had been briefed, the student body had been asked to treat him as normally as possible, and the university had the quiet cooperation of the local police in managing the practical security requirements of having the second person in the line of succession living in a student flat. The management produced, in practice, a campus that understood the situation and operated around it with the combination of genuine respect for his privacy and the specific social awareness of people who are in the presence of someone important and know it. Kate was in the lectures. She was also, by the accounts of people who were at St. Andrews in those years, precisely the kind of person who was in the lectures in the way that did not attract attention as an obvious strategy, which is the most important quality any strategy requires. She was good at History of Art. She was socially confident in the manner of someone who had completed the Marlborough formation and who had spent a gap year in environments that required adaptability. She was, by every account of her contemporaries that the biographies have collected, genuinely pleasant to be around, which is a quality no amount of maternal planning can manufacture, and that she possessed in her own right. The combination of the genuine qualities and the specific placement was what Tina Brown organized around the word orchestration, and the word is the right word, because an orchestra requires genuine musicians as well as a conductor, and what Carole had done was ensure that the musician was in the right concert hall. William's first year was difficult in ways the press subsequently reconstructed from palace insiders. He was not immediately happy. The course did not hold his interest in the way that the palace had hoped. By the spring of 2002, there were reports that he was considering leaving. The Queen and the Prince of Wales were both involved in the discussions around whether he would stay or go, and the intervention of the people closest to him in that period, including Kate, who had become by then a friend within the wider social circle that the first year produced, is credited in the accounts of the period with contributing to his decision to remain. The decision to remain was the decision on which everything else depended, and the friendship that contributed to it was the friendship that had been made possible by the university switch, and the elocution lessons, and the gap year, and the conversation in the Berkshire house in 2000, that the official account of the Middleton family has never fully described. The fashion show was Don't Walk, the annual charity catwalk organized by St. Andrew's students, held on the 27th of March 2002. Kate was among the models. The dress she wore for one of the sequences, designed by Charlotte Todd, was a sheer black mesh skirt, worn over a strapless bandeau, and the combination produced, under the stage lighting of the event, an effect that was close to transparent. The front row ticket, by the account that has circulated since, and that no participant has directly contradicted, cost William £200 in a charity auction. He sat in the front row. Kate walked. His remark to Fergus Boyd entered the anecdotal literature of the courtship and has stayed there. What has received less attention than the remark is the question of who knew what before the evening. The Don't Walk show was not a casual student event. It was organized and promoted, and its participants were known in advance, and the Prince of Wales's security arrangements required his team to know where he would be sitting and who would be on the stage before the evening began. Whether Carole knew is not established in the record. Whether Kate knew that William would be in the front row is not established in the record. What the record establishes is the outcome. The young man in the front row with the £200 ticket and the remark to his friend became, within months, the person Kate was spending most of her social time with, in the specific way that people who have been placed in each other's vicinity and who have genuine natural chemistry develop a social habit that the vicinity sustains and the chemistry deepens. The social habit developed inside the student flat at Salvieson's house in St. Andrews, where Kate, William, and two other students, Fergus Boyd and Olivia Bleasdale, shared an arrangement that the palace later described as an organic development of student friendship. The description is accurate about the chemistry and incomplete about the architecture. The flat share was the architecture that proximity required, and proximity, by the spring of 2002, was already producing what the fashion show had suggested it could. By the autumn of that year, by the accounts of their St. Andrews contemporaries, the friendship had become something more specific, conducted with the discretion that William's situation required, and that Kate provided without apparent difficulty. The discretion is worth examining, because it is the quality that the long courtship the following decade required, and that no amount of planning can install in a person who does not already possess it. Kate had it. The people who knew her at St. Andrews described someone who understood, from the beginning of the friendship's transition into something more intimate, exactly what the situation required of her, the absence of the behavior that would have converted a private relationship into a public story before either of them was ready for it to be one. She did not brief her friends. She did not conduct herself in public in ways that invited the inference. She did not, crucially, do anything with the situation that would have alarmed the palace before the palace had any reason to be alarmed. The discretion was the natural expression of a character that was, as the record of the following decade established, constitutionally suited to what was being asked of it. Carole's role in the St. Andrews years is documented in the accounts of the period in a form that the palace's official narrative has always treated as peripheral, and that the biographers examining the courtship consistently identify as something more central. She visited St. Andrews. She was in regular contact with Kate across the university years. She maintained the specific involvement in her daughter's life that the daughter's situation required, and the involvement was not the ordinary maternal contact of a parent whose child is at university 300 miles away. It was the involvement of someone who understood that the situation required management, and who provided the management through the one channel that the situation made natural, the mother-daughter relationship, which the palace's machinery and the press's cameras could not follow into. What Carole understood, and what the 3 years at St. Andrews confirmed, was that the situation required patience above everything else. The chessboard metaphor that Brown used is the right metaphor, because chess is a game whose outcome is determined not by the quality of individual moves, but by the quality of the player's willingness to wait for the position that makes the decisive move available. The Edinburgh decision had placed the piece on the right square. The gap year had covered the reasoning. The elocution lessons had prepared the presentation. The discretion had protected the developing relationship. What was required now was the patience to allow the development to proceed at the pace that William, who was not a young man to be rushed, required, and the patience to absorb the periods of uncertainty that the decade would produce, without either panicking or overcorrecting. The patience was tested within the first year of the post-university relationship, in circumstances this account examines in the following part, and the testing produced the first serious indication of what the Middleton management of the situation actually looked like when the situation stopped being manageable in the quiet way that St. Andrews had permitted, and became, for the first time, a problem that the press could see. Kate Middleton graduated from St. Andrews in June 2005 with a 2-1 in History of Art, and the photographs of the graduation ceremony, in which she stood beside William in academic gowns while their parents watched from the audience, produced the first official acknowledgement that the relationship was real in the form that the press required. Visual confirmation, in a public space, of two young people who had spent 3 years being careful not to be photographed together in a way that confirmed what everyone at St. Andrews already knew. The photographs ran everywhere. The caption writers reached for vocabulary they would use for the next 6 years. The future king and his girlfriend. The girlfriend word carried, even in 2005, a specific weight that the people applying it understood without needing to articulate. It was the word for someone who was not yet anything else, and not yet was the condition that the following years would make into a media category. The category had a name by 2006, Waity Katie. The tabloid construction, deployed with the specific cruelty that the British press brings to women in undefined relationships with powerful men, organized itself around the observation that Kate Middleton was 24 years old and had been with the heir to the throne for 3 years and was neither engaged nor broken up, which left her in the specific condition of someone waiting, and the waiting was the story, and the story was not kind. The unkindness was not incidental. It was the product of a press culture that had identified in the Middleton family something it recognized as social climbing, and that directed its discomfort with the recognition at the person who was most visible, which was Kate, rather than at the mechanism behind the visibility, which was Carole. The Chelsea years, from the summer of 2005 to the spring of 2007, are the period of the courtship that the official account of the Princess of Wales handles most carefully, which is to say most briefly, because the careful handling reflects the specific difficulty of describing years in which the woman who would become Princess of Wales was working part-time at a Chelsea accessories company called Jigsaw, and living in a flat in Chelsea managed by Carole, and attending events that the photographers documented with the consistency of people covering a story whose outcome they were already sure of, but whose timeline they could not predict. The official account of these years presents them as the natural continuation of a relationship between two young people who loved each other and were in no hurry. The biographies that examined the same period in more detail found something more managed. William's position in 2005 was the position of a 23-year-old who had left the specific enclosure of university, where the social world was defined and the proximity was structural, and entered the world that his role required him to occupy, which was the world of the army, the world of official engagements, the world of a young man whose life was organized around an institution's requirements, rather than around his own preferences. The army officer training at Sandhurst that he began in January 2006 produced an environment in which the relationship with Kate operated at the distance that Sandhurst's demands imposed, and the distance tested the relationship in the way that distance tests relationships, by requiring both people to sustain something across the gap rather than inside the proximity that had developed it. Kate sustained it. The manner in which she sustained it is the piece of the Waity Katie years that the Tina Brown account examines most carefully, and Brown's examination draws on sources inside the social world the couple occupied in those years. What the sources described was a woman who had internalized, by 2005, a specific discipline about her own conduct that the situation required, and that very few people in her position would have been capable of maintaining. She did not give interviews. She did not place herself in situations that generated coverage she could not control. She maintained a social presence in the Chelsea and Mayfair world that William also occupied, appearing at the parties and the nightclubs and the events where their paths could naturally cross, without ever organizing herself around his presence in a way that was visible as organization. She was simply there, in the places he was, with the frequency that a person with their own social life naturally achieves, and the naturalness was what the operation required. The jigsaw job, working for the accessories buyer Belle Robinson at the fashion company's head office in the Old Fulham Road, was part of the naturalistic presentation. It established Kate as a person with her own professional life, which was the specific credential the situation required at the moment it required it, because a woman with no professional identity was a different kind of story from a woman with a job, and the job, however part-time, supplied the narrative that covered the waiting. Robinson subsequently described Kate as a very hard worker who knew her own mind, an assessment that the people who observed Kate's conduct across the courtship years consistently produce. The intelligence was real, the self-possession was real, the competence was real. What was also real was the understanding that the competence and the self-possession needed to be visible in a context that made them legible as qualities of a person rather than as qualities of a project. Carole's involvement in the Chelsea years is documented in the specific form that the biographies find most reliable, through the practical arrangements whose existence is confirmed and whose significance is readable from outside. She managed the Chelsea flat, in the sense that the financial arrangements around the property involved her in ways that the press noted and the palace never found it necessary to address. She was in regular contact with Kate throughout the period, and the contact was the contact of a woman who had identified the situation's requirements from the beginning, and who maintained her engagement with those requirements with the consistency she brought to everything. The accounts of people who moved in the same social world as the Middletons in these years describe Carole as someone who was always present without ever being intrusive, always informed without ever appearing to seek information, always managing without ever appearing to manage. The non-appearance of management is the most advanced form of management, and Carole had been practicing it long enough to have made it look like personality. The summer of 2006 produced the photograph that first gave the Waity Katie coverage its sharpest edge. Kate in a bikini, on holiday in Ibiza with friends, photographed by a freelance photographer who had identified the commercial value of an image of William's girlfriend in a state of informal undress. The photographs were published. The palace's response was the response it applies to unwanted coverage of people who are not yet under its protection. It said nothing, because Kate was not officially a royal figure, and its communications machinery had no mandate to operate on her behalf. She was, in the specific legal and institutional sense, a private person. The private person's privacy was not the palace's to protect. William was furious. The fury was the fury of someone who had understood from childhood what the press was capable of, and who had watched it applied now to the person he was with. But the fury had no institutional outlet, because the institution had no formal relationship with Kate. She was the girlfriend. Girlfriends were not palace business. The girlfriend status, and the institutional limbo it represented, was the central fact of the Waity Katie years, and its implications extended beyond the privacy question to the question of what the limbo actually cost Kate in the specific currencies of time and reputation, and the daily experience of being a young woman whose public identity was organized entirely around a relationship whose formal resolution was not in her control. She was 25 in January 2007, then 26 in January 2008. The tabloids marked each birthday with coverage that the Waity Katie frame organized around the question the frame had always asked: how long was she going to wait? The question was addressed to her, but its real addressee was William, who was the person whose decision was awaited, and William, by the accounts of people close to him in those years, was not ready to make it. His hesitation is documented in the accounts of the period with varying degrees of source quality, and the most careful account, Robert Lacey's Battle of Brothers, published in 2020, describes it in terms that the palace insiders Lacey drew on were specific about. William had doubts about the permanence of what he felt, doubts about whether he was ready for the commitment that a proposal represented, and doubts of a more specific kind about the Middleton family, that the court's culture around class had produced in a young man who had grown up inside that culture and absorbed its assessments. William's friends, by multiple accounts, made the doors to manual remark about Carole's airline background at the Bougies nightclub in West London, where the social world that connected the aristocratic young and the wealthy young and the royal adjacent young assembled regularly, and the remark was not made once, but many times, by multiple people, and William was in the company when it was made. Whether he made it himself, no source has confirmed. That he heard it and did not object to it in any recorded form that reached the biographers is the evidence the record contains. The doors to manual remark, and what it represented about the social world's assessment of the Middleton family, arrived in early 2007, at the moment when the relationship was at its most fragile, and the arrival produced the event that the official account of the courtship describes as a temporary separation, and that the less official accounts describe as something more deliberate on at least one side. In March 2007, William ended the relationship. The accounts of how the ending happened differ in their details and agree in their essentials. It was his decision, it was not entirely clean, and Kate received it in the specific manner that the following weeks would make visible to the press, and that the press would subsequently identify as the move that changed the game. She did not call him, she did not attempt contact, she did not appear distressed in public, which was the appearance the press was watching for, because distress was the story that the distressed girlfriend provides, and Kate did not provide it. She went out, she attended events. She wore the clothes that the fashion coverage would describe as her post-breakup wardrobe, which is to say, the clothes of someone who was not hiding and was not suffering visibly, and the not hiding, produced in the watching, pressed the specific counter-narrative that the hiding would have prevented. A young woman who was apparently fine, who was going out and looking well, who seemed to have absorbed the ending of a 5-year relationship with the heir to the throne, with a composure that either reflected genuine equanimity or was the most effective performance of equanimity that the tabloid era had produced. The performance, if it was a performance, was Carole's education expressing itself, and the education's text was the one lesson that every stage of the courtship had demonstrated. The situation required the appearance of the thing that the situation required, rather than the expression of the thing that the person was actually experiencing. Whether Kate was actually fine in the weeks after the March 2007 breakup is a question no source has ever answered from inside her experience, because the inside of her experience was the one thing the strategy had always kept private. What the outside showed was a woman going about her life, and the outside was what William saw when he looked, and what William saw when he looked was, by the accounts of the people close to him in those months, the thing that made the looking uncomfortable in a way that the not looking would eventually become unbearable. He came back, within months. The specific mechanism of the reconciliation is described in the accounts of the period as the natural outcome of a separation that had clarified what was at stake, which is the description that reconciliations generally attract from the people inside them, because it is the most bearable description available. What the record establishes is the outcome. By the summer of 2007, the relationship had resumed, and resumed in the specific form that made the following years different from the preceding ones. The doubts had not been resolved. The doors to manual culture in which William had grown up had not changed its assessment of the Middletons. What had changed was William's understanding of what the alternative to the uncertainty felt like, and the alternative had felt, across the months of the separation, like something he was not prepared to accept. The reconciliation produced the engagement that arrived 3.5 years later, in Kenya, in October 2010, and in between stood the years in which the palace's private assessment of the Middleton family moved from the social anxiety of the courtship period into something more specific, more documented, and considerably more uncomfortable for the institution managing it. The vetting of a prospective royal spouse is not a process that the palace acknowledges publicly, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging what the process is for, which is the assessment of whether a private individual is suitable for permanent incorporation into an institution whose requirements the individual has not been asked to consent to, and cannot fully understand until they are inside them. The vetting happens nonetheless, conducted through the informal channels that the court has developed across centuries for exactly this purpose. the quiet conversation with the right person, the assessment of the family's financial and personal history through sources whose connection to the intelligence services is never confirmed and never denied. The circulation of the findings through the household in the specific form of the assessment that the senior members of the institution require before they will give their private approval to a match, whose public announcement will then be framed as a romantic development. The Middleton vetting, by the accounts assembled in Tina Brown's Palace Papers and corroborated in the separate research of Katie Nicholl for the New Royals published in 2022, was more extensive than the public account of the engagement has ever acknowledged, because the Middleton family presented the vetting process with a specific set of complications that a simpler background would not have produced. The complications were not primarily financial, though the financial picture had its own dimensions. They were primarily the complications of a family whose social position and whose conduct across the courtship years had generated in the palace's senior household a reaction that the senior household's vocabulary organized around class, and that the biographers examining the reaction organized around something harder. The word that circulated, as this account established at its opening, was ruthless. The people who used it were not using it as a compliment, and they were not using it as a condemnation. They were using it in the specific way that institutions use words to describe the qualities in outsiders that the institution recognizes as the qualities it deploys itself and finds uncomfortable to see deployed against it. The palace has always been ruthless in the management of its own interests, the management of the press, the management of the succession, the management of the public narrative around the family. What the senior household found in the Middleton family, and what the word ruthless described, was a matching quality operating from outside the walls, directed toward the walls, in a manner that the institution could recognize as effective, and that it could not, on reflection, find a specific procedural objection to, because the Middletons had broken no rule. They had simply played the game with more deliberate skill than the institution's rules had been designed to prevent. Charles, then Prince of Wales, was among the senior members of the household whose private views on the Middleton family the biographers subsequently assembled from their sources, and the views were not straightforwardly negative. They were the views of a man who had himself spent the most formative years of his adult life inside a marriage that had been organized around institutional requirements rather than personal compatibility, and who had watched what institutional marriages did to the people inside them, and who had observed, across the years of the courtship, that Kate Middleton was someone whose personal qualities were substantial, regardless of the family's strategic dimension. He noted, in the accounts of people who discussed Kate with him during the courtship years, her composure, her self-possession, the specific quality of steadiness that the Waity Katie years had demonstrated and that his own experience had taught him to value. He was, by these accounts, broadly supportive of the match before the formal vetting confirmed what the informal assessment had established. What the formal vetting confirmed was less uniformly reassuring. The Middleton family's financial history, examined through the channels the palace employed, was the history of a successful business built from nothing, which was in one register admirable, and in another register the specific proof of new money that old institutions identify with the specific discomfort that old institutions have always brought to new money. Party pieces had been valued at approximately £30 million at its peak in the early 2000s, and the fortune it represented was the fortune of a family that had constructed its wealth across one generation rather than inherited it across several, and the construction, however admirable in the abstract, produced in the senior household the specific social anxiety that English class consciousness reserves for people who have arrived recently and whose arrival is still visible in the way they conduct themselves. The conduct was the dimension of the vetting that produced the most pointed discussions. The Middletons had, across the years of the courtship, operated in ways that the palace's senior staff found professionally comprehensible and personally uncomfortable. They had placed themselves, consistently and with apparent ease, in the exact social positions that the courtship required. They had managed the press access to the family with the specific skill of people who understood how press access works and how its withdrawal is more effective than its provision. They had presented a public face of the normal English family, in Berkshire with the church and the village shop and the golden retriever, that the press had received and reproduced, and that covered, with practiced thoroughness, the specific strategic intelligence that had produced the face. They had done all of this without a publicist, without an advisor, without any of the professional apparatus that people in their position normally deploy, because the absence of the professional apparatus was itself the most effective piece of the presentation. The Gary Goldsmith problem was the complication that the vetting could not resolve, and that the palace eventually learned to manage through the mechanism it applies to all unresolvable complications in the families of royal spouses, which is silence and time. Gary Goldsmith was Carole's younger brother, Kate's uncle, a self-made IT recruitment millionaire who had built his fortune in the same spirit of focused commercial ambition that his sister had applied to party pieces, and who had, in the construction of the fortune, departed further from the Bucklebury village presentation than the palace found comfortable. He owned a villa in Ibiza that he named La Maison de Bang Bang. He had been married 4 times by the time the engagement was announced. He used recreational drugs, a fact that the News of the World established through a sting operation in 2009, when an undercover reporter gained access to the Ibiza villa and recorded Goldsmith offering cocaine. The recording was published. The palace noted it. Gary Goldsmith existed in the family tree that William was proposing to marry into, and the palace managed his existence in the manner it always manages such existences, by ensuring that he was not part of the official narrative of the family, and by hoping that the press would move on. The press moved on because the press had a larger story to follow, which was the engagement itself, and the engagement came at the moment when the palace's private discomfort with the Middletons had been running for long enough that the discomfort had either to be acted on or absorbed. The palace absorbed it, as it absorbs most things it cannot resolve, and the absorption was announced on the 16th of November 2010 in the form of William and Kate on the steps of the Kensington Palace Gardens, wearing the sapphire engagement ring that had belonged to Diana, and fielding the questions of the press pool with the specific competence that the courtship years had given both of them. The ring choice was William's, and it was a choice whose significance the palace understood before the press pool did. Diana's engagement ring was the most famous piece of jewelry in the world, and its placement on Kate's finger was the most direct possible statement about the succession of feeling that William was making, the connection of Kate to Diana in the public imagination that the ring accomplished without a word being spoken. It was also a statement whose implications the palace's communications operation had not been given advance warning of, by the accounts of the people inside it at the time, because William had made the decision independently and informed the palace of it shortly before the announcement, rather than consulting it in advance. The ring was his mother's and it was his to give, and he gave it, and the palace's communications team managed the narrative that the ring generated with the machinery they had developed over decades of managing the narratives around Diana's objects and Diana's memory, and the specific public emotion that both reliably produced. The engagement announcement generated coverage that converted the social history of the courtship into the love story the public required, in the specific manner that engagement announcements always convert the preceding years into the story that the announcement retrospectively makes them. The Waity Katie coverage became the proof of steadfast devotion. The Edinburgh to St Andrews switch was not mentioned. The elocution lessons were not mentioned. The conversations that Tina Brown's sources described, the fingerprints on the chessboard, were not mentioned. The coverage described 2 young people who had met at university and fallen in love and taken their time and arrived at the decision that love produces when it has been given sufficient time to demonstrate its permanence. It was not false. It was organized around the portion of the truth that the occasion required, which is the specific form of honesty that institutions practice when they manage announcements, and the occasion was sufficiently large and sufficiently welcome after the years of waiting that the press and the public were not in a mood to examine the portions of the truth that the announcement's framing had selected against. The palace's private accommodation of the Middletons was complete, or nearly so. What was not yet complete was the family's own accommodation of the palace, which is to say, the specific process by which a family that has spent a decade managing the approach to an institution from outside has to learn to manage its relationship with the institution from inside, and the learning curve that the transition required produced, across the years following the engagement, a series of incidents whose pattern the press covered as individual stories, and whose connection the biographies subsequently established as something more systematic. The most immediately visible of those incidents concerned not Kate but Pippa, whose presence at the wedding, in a dress that produced one of the most covered photographs of the entire event, created for the palace a new management problem whose dimensions the morning of the 29th of April 2011 did not yet fully reveal. The problem was not Pippa herself, who was by all accounts entirely pleasant and whose maid-of-honor duties she discharged with a grace that the public responded to warmly. The problem was what Pippa represented, the second Middleton, with her own public identity and her own press attention and her own commercial ambitions, operating in the proximity of the institution without the institution's control or its protection, and without the specific discipline that Kate had spent a decade developing. At approximately 11:30 on the morning of the 29th of April 2011, Philippa Charlotte Middleton stepped out of a car at the west door of Westminster Abbey, wearing a white Alexander McQueen dress that had been designed by Sarah Burton to function as a complementary piece to the bride's gown, and the global press corps that had assembled for the wedding of the century produced, in addition to the coverage of the bride, a secondary story whose dimensions nobody in the Middleton family or the palace had fully anticipated. The dress fit precisely. The fit was the story. By the end of that afternoon, the dress and the person inside it had generated a volume of coverage that the palace's communications operation had not planned for and could not manage, because the coverage was not hostile and was not the product of an intrusion and could not be addressed through the mechanisms the palace applies to coverage it wants to suppress. It was simply the coverage of a young woman who had appeared in a perfect dress at the most watched event of the year and who, by the accident of the dress's fit and the angle of the photographer's lenses, had become, in the specific manner of the internet age, a phenomenon. The phenomenon had a name by the following morning. The internet had decided that Pippa Middleton's posterior was the most discussed physical feature in the English-speaking world, and the decision, taken collectively and without editorial direction, produced the specific kind of celebrity that is manufactured by volume rather than by design, and that nobody with a functional instinct for self-protection would have chosen. Pippa had not chosen it. The dress had been chosen by the bride. The coverage was the product of the day's specific chemistry of event and audience, and the new mechanisms of social sharing that 2011 had made available for exactly this kind of collective response. None of that was Pippa's fault, and the palace understood that it was not her fault, which was why the palace's response was not directed at Pippa, but at the situation the coverage had created, which was the situation of a woman who was now famous in a way that the palace had no framework for managing. The framework the palace applies to the people adjacent to the royal family is the framework of the quietly managed private life. The person is present at the official occasions, is photographed with appropriate dignity, declines the invitations that the press extends toward people in their position, and allows the proximity to the institution to generate a moderate social profile that does not compete with or complicate the institution's own communications. The framework requires the adjacent person's cooperation, and the cooperation requires the adjacent person to understand that the framework is in their interest as well as the institution's. Pippa had not yet been given this understanding in any formal sense, because the framework had not yet been applied to her, because the wedding had not yet happened, and the wedding had produced the situation faster than any framework could have anticipated. What followed the wedding, across the 18 months that produced the event the palace came to call the Pippa problem, was a sequence of decisions that Pippa made about her own public profile that the palace received with the specific mixture of concern and helplessness that institutions feel when a person adjacent to them exercises their legal right to make decisions that the institution cannot prevent and that complicate the institution's management of its own narrative. She gave an interview to Tatler. She signed with an agent. Vanity Fair put her on its cover. She wrote a column for the American editions of Condé Nast titles, and the column was the column of someone who had a public identity and was using it, which was precisely the behavior the framework required her not to display. The book was the episode that concentrated the palace's concern most sharply. Celebrate, a year of festivities for families and friends, published by Penguin in October 2012, was Pippa Middleton's guide to entertaining across the calendar year. and its publication was greeted by the press with the combination of commercial interest and critical amusement that books by famous people, who are not primarily writers, tend to generate. The book was well produced and adequately written, and completely without the authority that would have justified its existence in any world where Pippa Middleton was not the sister of the Duchess of Cambridge. The reviews said so, in terms that ranged from the gently dismissive to the openly contemptuous, and the contempt was the specific contempt that the English press directs at social climbers who have been identified as such, and who are perceived to be converting their connection to the aristocracy into commercial product. The book sold poorly relative to its advance and well relative to its merits, which is the outcome that books in its category routinely produce. The palace's discomfort with the book was not primarily literary, it was institutional. The book's existence confirmed, in the specific public form of a major publisher's imprint and a Penguin advance, that Pippa Middleton was operating her proximity to the crown as a commercial asset, which was precisely what the palace's framework for adjacent family members was designed to prevent. Because the commercial operation of royal adjacency produces the specific kind of coverage that asks questions about the institution's relationship to commerce that the institution prefers not to have asked. The questions were being asked. The palace could not answer them publicly without drawing more attention to the situation it was trying to manage. It managed in silence, which is the management technique it applies when all other techniques are unavailable. James Middleton provided the parallel management problem across the same years, in a different register and through different mechanisms, and his portion of the Middleton family's relationship with the palace in the post-wedding period belongs in this account in its own right, because the James problem was the problem that the family could not solve from inside the family's resources, and that time, eventually, resolved in the direction of something that the palace found acceptable. James had launched a confectionery company called Nice Cakes in 2011, which used the Duchess of Cambridge's wedding cake supplier's name in its branding, and which the press identified, within weeks of its launch, as a business whose commercial proposition rested substantially on its founder's family connection to the most famous wedding of the decade. The identification was accurate. Nice Cakes failed. James subsequently launched Boomf, a personalized marshmallow company, which attracted investment and generated coverage, and eventually ran into the specific difficulties that companies founded by people whose primary public credential is a famous sibling encounter when the coverage moves on. Boomf struggled. The pattern of James's business ventures in the post-wedding years, examined in the business press accounts and the Sunday supplement profiles, was the pattern of a personable young man whose commercial ideas were not implausible, but whose execution consistently underperformed the investment, and whose name generated initial attention that could not be converted into sustainable commercial momentum because the attention was not actually about the business, it was about the family. The palace noted the businesses and noted the coverage, and said nothing publicly, and managed the situation through the mechanism it always applies to the adjacent family members' commercial activities, the application of quiet pressure through the family's own channels, which is to say through Carole, who was the person the palace could reach most directly, and whose understanding of the situation was the most sophisticated in the family. Carole's management of the palace's concerns about her children's public activities is not a documented conversation in any source this account has access to, because the management happened through the private channels that the palace's relationship with the Middleton family operated through, and that neither party has described in terms that reached the public record. What is documented is the outcome. Pippa's public profile contracted across 2013 and 2014. The column ended. The book was not followed by a second book. The agent relationship was restructured, and the woman who had been photographed at every major London social event in 2011 and 2012 began to appear at fewer of them, and the ones she appeared at were the ones the palace could most easily accommodate within its framework. The management was successful in the institutional sense, which is to say that the Pippa problem ceased to generate the daily coverage that had characterized 2011 and 2012, and the cessation was the definition of success that the palace applied to it. What it cost Pippa personally is the dimension of the Pippa problem that the public coverage never adequately examined, because the coverage was organized around the coverage itself rather than around the person generating it. She had been, at the wedding, an entirely private individual who had not sought public life, and who had not made any decision that morning that was different from the decisions she had made at every other family occasion across her adult life, which was to show up, do her job, and let the day belong to her sister. The dress had been chosen to complement the bride. The fit had been a matter between the dress and its wearer and the laws of physics. The phenomenon had arrived without her consent, and with consequences she had not prepared for and could not fully control. And the management of those consequences by her family and by the palace had been conducted primarily in terms of the palace's institutional interests, rather than in terms of Pippa's own interests as a person who had not chosen to be in the position she was now in. The parallel with the broader Middleton situation is not incidental. The family's entire trajectory had been organized around the project of placing Kate inside the institution, and the success of the project had produced, as its collateral effects, the public positioning of Pippa and James in relation to the institution in ways that neither of them had been specifically consulted about, and that the success of the project made unavoidable. Pippa had not been part of any strategy. She was the strategy's sibling, which was a different and more complicated position, because the sibling of the strategy's subject inherits the visibility without the preparation, and the public role without the framework, and the coverage without the protection. The protection, such as it was, arrived in 2016 in the form of James Matthews, the hedge fund manager and eldest son of David Matthews, owner of the Eden Rock Resort in St. Bart's, who had accumulated, through the management of a London-based hedge fund called Eden Rock Capital Management, a personal fortune estimated in the hundreds of millions. Matthews was privately educated, socially credible in the specific manner of the financially successful rather than the aristocratically connected, and possessed of the quality that the palace's framework for adjacent family members most prizes, the inclination toward privacy. He had no interest in public life. He had no desire for the profile that marriage to Pippa Middleton would generate. He wanted, by the accounts of people who knew him in these years, a quiet life conducted in the company of the woman he had decided to marry, and the quiet life was precisely what the palace most needed the Pippa situation to become. They married in May 2017 at St. Mark's Church in Englefield, Berkshire, in a ceremony that the palace had no role in managing, and that managed itself in the direction the palace most required, a private wedding, conducted without the apparatus of public ceremony, attended by a guest list that included, controversially, James Matthews's brother Spencer Matthews, the Made in Chelsea television personality whose inclusion generated its own brief wave of coverage and subsided. The wedding photographs showed Pippa in a Giles Deacon gown, serene and private, and finally, for the first time since the morning of April 29, 2011, in a setting that the palace's framework for adjacent family members was designed to produce. She was no longer the Pippa problem. She was, within months of the wedding, simply Pippa Matthews, resident of a West Berkshire estate with a hedge fund manager husband, and, in October 2018, a son named Arthur. The resolution of the Pippa situation through the mechanism of a wealthy, privately inclined marriage was the resolution the palace had been managing toward since 2011, and its achievement produced a specific kind of institutional relief that the palace could not express publicly and did not need to. The problem had been managed. The adjacent family member had been incorporated into the framework that the framework required. The coverage had moved on. What the coverage had not yet moved on from, because it had not yet arrived at its full dimensions, was the Middleton family's commercial empire, whose peak was approaching in the years of the wedding, and whose subsequent trajectory would produce, a decade later, the financial crisis that landed in the worst possible week of the worst possible year for the family to be associated with financial crisis. In the spring of 1987, Carole Middleton sat at a kitchen table in the village of Bradfield Southend in Berkshire and made the first party bag that would eventually fund a princess. The bag contained balloons and a whistle and a small cake and the items that children's parties require, assembled by a woman who had identified a gap in the market with the specific attention to detail that would come to define everything she touched, and mailed to a customer who had found the advertisement she had placed in a local publication. The first bag was the first transaction of what would become, across the following 30 years, a business valued at approximately £30 million, employing dozens of staff, operating from a warehouse in Ashampstead Green, Berkshire, and generating the commercial revenues that funded the education at Marlborough and the Berkshire houses and the social infrastructure that the strategy required. The business was built on Carole's instincts and maintained by her attention. She understood, before the internet made it a standard business insight, that parents buying supplies for children's parties were not primarily buying objects. They were buying the reassurance that the occasion would be managed correctly, that the decorations would arrive on time and in the right quantities, and that the anxiety that surrounds the production of the perfect childhood birthday party in the specific social world of the English middle class would be addressed by someone who had thought about it more carefully than the parent had time to. Party Pieces thought about it more carefully. The website, developed through the 1990s as internet commerce became a viable channel, organized the party supplies into themed collections that removed the decision-making burden from the customer and replaced it with the confident curatorial voice of someone who had decided that this was what a space-themed birthday for a 7-year-old required, and the customer paid for the curation as much as the supplies. Kate worked for the company in her early 20s, developing the birthday and baby category, and the work gave her a professional credential that the jigsaw job subsequently provided in more public form, but the Party Pieces work was the work she was trained for from inside the family operation, and the training was the training that the company's founder provided, which was the training of someone who understood that attention to the customer's actual need, rather than to the product being sold, was the principle that separated businesses that lasted from businesses that did not. Whether Kate absorbed the principle as a commercial insight or as a daughter learning her mother's work, the absorption is documented in the specific quality of her subsequent engagement with the charitable foundations she would develop after the wedding, which are organized around exactly the same principle, the identification of what the end user actually requires, rather than what the institution providing it has found convenient to offer. The peak of Party Pieces as a commercial operation arrived in the years immediately following the 2011 wedding. The combination of the royal connections' publicity value and the genuine commercial strength of the business's established model produced, in the coverage of the company that the wedding generated, the specific kind of attention that accelerates the growth of businesses that are already working. Orders increased. The press covered the company in the register of the human interest story that the royal family's commercial adjacencies always attract, the party supply business that the princess's mother built. The coverage was free advertising for a product that was genuinely good, and the combination produced the valuation that the trade press settled on in 2013, approximately £30 million, which was the valuation of a business at the peak of its commercial momentum, operating in a market it had helped create, with a brand association that no competitor could replicate. Carole stepped back from the day-to-day management of Party Pieces in 2019, handing operational control to a management team that the company had developed across its years of growth. The step back was the step back of a woman who had spent 30 years building something and who had other priorities: her grandchildren, her daughter's developing public role, the specific form of support that Kate's position as a senior working royal required from the family around her. The management team inherited a business whose fundamentals were sound and whose brand was the most valuable asset in its category, and the inheritance included a business model that had been developed for a specific retail environment, the mail order and early internet commerce world of the late 1980s and 1990s, that the subsequent decade had transformed in ways that the model had not fully adapted to. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in March 2020 and administered to Party Pieces, along with the majority of the retail economy, a demand shock whose dimensions the business had not been designed to absorb. Children's parties stopped. Events stopped. The supply chain that fed the warehouse in Ashampstead Green continued to generate costs at a moment when the revenues that covered those costs had fallen to a fraction of their pre-pandemic level. The company survived 2020 and 2021 through the mechanisms that businesses of its scale apply to survival: cost reduction, creditor management, the utilization of whatever government support the pandemic relief programs made available. It emerged from the pandemic smaller and more indebted than it had entered it, which was the condition of most businesses in its sector, and which was not, on its own, the condition of a business that was necessarily terminal. What the post-pandemic period produced was the specific challenge that legacy businesses face when the market they were built for has been replaced by a market organized around different platforms, different purchasing behaviors, and different competitors. Amazon and the aggregated marketplace of online retail had changed the economics of the mail-order party supply business in ways that Party Pieces had been managing since the early 2010s without fully resolving. The company's brand remained strong. The company's cost structure remained the cost structure of a business that had been built for a different scale of operation. The management team that had inherited the company from Carole was managing the gap between the two with the instruments available to them, which were insufficient. In the spring of 2023, the instruments were exhausted. The Times reported in April of that year that Party Pieces was seeking a rescue deal, having approached potential buyers and investors in an attempt to find the commercial solution that the company's balance sheet required. Carole returned to the company during this period, resuming an active involvement in the search for a rescue that her step back from operations had interrupted. The rescue did not arrive in the form the company needed. In May 2023, Party Pieces Limited was placed into administration by its directors. The administrator's report, subsequently filed with Companies House, recorded that the company had entered administration owing creditors approximately £2,600,000 and that the company's assets were insufficient to meet the costs of the administration itself, let alone the creditors' claims. The filing date was the fact that the palace's communications operation noted with the specific attention it applies to events that intersect with the management of the royal family's public narrative, because the filing date was not an isolated piece of business news. It arrived in the specific week of the specific month that the palace had been managing, with all the care and all the professional communications skill at its disposal, since the 5th of January 2023, when Kate had been admitted to the London clinic for what the palace described as planned abdominal surgery. The surgery had been performed, the recovery had been managed. The communications around the recovery had been managed with the specific language of an institution that was disclosing exactly as much as it judged necessary and nothing beyond it, which produced the specific dynamic of a public that was receiving careful language and constructing from that language an understanding of the situation that the careful language had been specifically designed not to confirm or deny. The Party Pieces administration landed in this environment in May 2023, and its landing produced the coverage that the landing of a £2.6 million insolvency in the mother of the Princess of Wales always produces. The juxtaposition coverage, the arithmetic that sets the civil list allocation, and the royal wedding, and the Kensington Palace apartments, and the Scottish holiday houses against the creditors' claims, and produces the specific question that royal family coverage has always found most commercially productive, which is the question of who is paying for what, and whether the arrangement is as straightforward as the official account suggests. The palace's response was no response, which is the response it applies to coverage of the family members' commercial activities when no response is the most effective available option. Christopher Anderson, the American royal biographer who was asked about the administration by media outlets in the days following the filing, told the outlets something that the palace's silence had implied, that between the king's cancer and Kate's recovery, the last thing the royal family had on their minds was how much the Middletons owed their creditors. The framing was accurate in the specific sense that the palace's communications priorities in May 2023 were organized around the management of two serious medical situations inside the family, and the management of those situations left limited bandwidth for the management of the peripheral story of a party supply company's insolvency. It was also framing that served the palace's interest by converting the commercial question into the human story, the sick princess and her worried family, which was the conversion the palace preferred and which the coverage, largely, made. What the administration did not do, and what the coverage of it consistently failed to examine, was connect the insolvency to the commercial history that this account has traced. The business that had funded the schools and the houses and the social infrastructure of the strategy, now unable to meet the claims of the suppliers and the employees and the service providers who had been part of its operation, at the exact moment when the strategy's most significant outcome, Kate as Princess of Wales, was fighting cancer at the age of 41. The connection between the commercial instrument and the institutional product it had created was not the connection that the coverage found useful. because the coverage was organized around the human story of a sick princess and her loyal family, and the commercial story of the business that had made the family what it was sat uncomfortably alongside the human story, and was therefore not placed alongside it. The employees who lost their jobs when Party Pieces entered administration are not identified by name in the public record, because the employees of a privately held company of Party Pieces' size are not the employees whose names the press accounts, which is to say the accounts of people close enough to the story to have names that appear in the coverage. They were the people who had worked for the company Carole had built, who had answered the phones and managed the warehouse and processed the orders and contributed to the commercial operation that had funded, across 36 years, the project that ended with a Princess of Wales. The project's success was not their success. The insolvency's cost was, in part, theirs. The specific irony of the timing, which is the irony that the palace's silence was most carefully designed to prevent from becoming the coverage's organizing frame, is that the business that had made the Middletons what they were ceased to exist in the same season that the Middleton who had most completely become what the business was built to produce needed her family most. Carole was managing the administration and managing Kate's recovery simultaneously, the woman who had planned the ascent now managing its costs and its consequences in the same weeks, in the Berkshire house that the ascent had purchased, while her grandchildren went to school and her daughter recovered, and the company filed its papers with Companies House, and the creditors waited for the distribution that the administrator's report indicated would not fully cover their claims. The administrator subsequently sold the Party Pieces brand and its digital assets to an entrepreneur named James Cox, whose background was in entertainment, and whose acquisition of the brand produced a brief flurry of coverage about the company's continuation under new ownership, and the flurry was the last coverage that Party Pieces generated as a story rather than a footnote. The business that Carole had built at the kitchen table in 1987 passed into other hands in 2023, and the passing was unremarked by the palace and managed in silence by the family, and the silence was the last and most complete expression of the quality that had organized everything from the beginning. What the silence covered, by the summer of 2023, was a family at the most complicated moment of its relationship with the institution it had spent a generation joining, the commercial foundation gone, the matriarch managing a crisis on multiple fronts, the princess recovering, and the palace watching all of it with the specific attention of an institution that had absorbed the Middleton family into itself and now had to manage the consequences of the absorption alongside everything else it was managing. The consequences included one family member whose story the palace had been managing since 2011 and whose resolution through marriage this account has already examined. They also included the one whose story the palace had never fully managed and whose specific category of difficulty had not, in the years since the wedding, produced the quiet resolution that the Pippa situation had eventually achieved. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The morning after the wedding, Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, woke up inside an institution that had spent the preceding decade watching her approach, and that now had to decide what to do with her. The decision was not straightforward, because the institution had not, in the years of the courtship, given significant thought to the question of what a woman of Kate's specific formation would need from it in order to become what the institution required her to become, and the oversight was the oversight of an institution organized around the management of the approach rather than the preparation for the arrival. She had been vetted, she had been observed, she had been assessed for the qualities that the role required. What she had not been given was any systematic preparation for the role itself, and the absence of preparation was the specific gap that the first years inside the institution exposed with a consistency that the palace's senior staff noted and managed with the specific care of people who understand that the management of the gap is more important than the acknowledgement of it. The training that the institution provided for new members in 2011 was the training it had always provided, which was no training in any formal sense, but a gradual immersion in the requirements of the role through the experience of performing it. The debutante balls and the finishing schools that earlier generations of royal wives had attended had long since ceased to be the mechanism through which the institution prepared its new members, and the replacement mechanism, which was the assumption that a sufficiently intelligent and socially capable person would absorb the requirements through observation and experience, was the mechanism that had been applied to Diana in 1981, with results the institution had spent 30 years processing. The assumption was applied again to Kate in 2011, and the results, in Kate's case, were substantially different, because the person to whom the assumption was applied was substantially different from Diana, in ways that the strategic reading of the Middleton approach makes obvious in retrospect, and that the palace's senior staff understood earlier than the coverage suggested. Kate had been preparing for the role since 2001, which is the statement that the strategic account of the courtship produces when it is extended to its logical conclusion. A decade of observation and discretion and social management, conducted in the proximity of the institution and in full awareness of what the institution required, was not the preparation of a finishing school, but it was a preparation, and it was a preparation that produced in the woman who arrived inside the walls in April 2011, a specific quality that the women who had arrived before her had not possessed, the knowledge of what she was walking into. Diana had not known. Sarah Ferguson had not known. The women who had married into the family before the age of the internet and the tabloid royal coverage, and the specific public anatomy of the institution's requirements, had not known in the way that Kate knew, because the information had not been available to them in the form it was available to her. Kate had read the coverage, she had watched the precedents, she had spent 10 years understanding the institution from outside before she entered it, and the understanding gave her the specific advantage of the person who has studied the terrain before crossing it. The advantage was visible from the first weeks. Philip Eade, the biographer whose 2022 account of William drew on sources inside the palace across the transition period, described a new duchess who absorbed the role's requirements with a speed that the senior household found, in private, reassuring rather than surprising, because the speed was the speed of someone who had been rehearsing rather than someone who was learning. The engagements were performed correctly from the beginning. The press was managed with the specific quality of controlled accessibility that the palace's communications operation had developed across decades of managing the press, and that Kate deployed without the instruction that the deployment normally required. The clothes were right, the manner was right. The specific combination of warmth and reserve that the role requires, the warmth that allows the public to feel seen, and the reserve that maintains the distance that the institution requires for its dignity, was calibrated from the first engagement with a precision that senior courtiers noted in the private assessments that the biographies subsequently drew on. What the palace had not fully anticipated was the speed at which Kate's personal projects would develop, because the personal projects were the dimension of the role that the courtship years had not prepared her for, and the development of a senior royal's personal charitable platform is the one aspect of the institutional role that cannot be rehearsed from outside. It requires the inside position to activate, because the platform's authority derives from the position rather than from the person, and the person cannot exercise the position's authority until the position is theirs. Kate's authority arrived with the wedding, and the use she made of it across the first years. The development of what would become the Royal Foundation Centre for Early Childhood reflects a process of genuine intellectual development that the coverage of the courtship years, organized around the strategic reading of the Middletons, consistently underestimated. The early childhood focus did not arrive fully formed. The palace's accounts of its development, assembled from the people who worked with Kate on the Foundation's early programming, describe a process of genuine inquiry. The reading of the developmental psychology literature, the visits to the academic institutions whose research was shaping the field, the conversations with the practitioners who were working with young children and their families in the specific contexts of disadvantage and trauma that the research identified as the moments of highest developmental significance. The inquiry was genuine in the sense that it produced a platform whose intellectual coherence and research grounding went substantially beyond what a purely ceremonial engagement with the subject would have required, and the genuineness was noted by the academics and practitioners whose work Kate engaged with, and who described the engagement in terms that reflected genuine surprise at its depth. The three children arrived across the first 7 years: George on the 22nd of July 2013, Charlotte on the 2nd of May 2015, Louis on the 23rd of April 2018. Each birth managed with the combination of public acknowledgement and private protection that the institution deploys for the births of children in the line of succession, each child immediately famous, and each child's parents subsequently engaged in the specific project of raising children who are simultaneously private individuals and public symbols, a project that no preceding generation of their family had fully succeeded at, and that Kate and William were attempting with the conscious awareness of what the failure of that project had produced in the generation before them. The Meghan factor arrived in 2017 and reorganized everything. Meghan Markle's entry into the family, her engagement to Harry in November 2017, and her marriage in May 2018, produced in the institution a set of challenges that the institution had not managed before, and produced in Kate's specific position within the institution a set of changes that the coverage of the subsequent years organized around the two women's relationship, and that the actual record, assembled from the palace insiders, whose accounts reached the biographers, organizes around something more structural. Kate's position before Meghan's arrival was the position of the most senior working female royal of her generation, the position of the person who was managing the specific demands of that role with the competence and the discretion that the institution required, and rewarding. Meghan's arrival created a parallel, and the parallel immediately generated the comparison that parallels within the royal family always generate, which is the comparison that the institution manages by establishing a hierarchy of significance and communicating the hierarchy through the specific mechanisms of protocol and precedence that the institution has developed for exactly this purpose. The tiara incident belongs in the record because it is the piece of the Kate-Meghan relationship that the palace's subsequent management of the Meghan narrative organized around, and because its documentary status is the status of a claim made by Meghan in the Oprah interview of March 2021 that was subsequently contradicted by palace sources in a manner that the palace's communications operation deployed with specific care. Meghan said in the Oprah interview that Kate had made her cry before the wedding over a question of the flower girl's dresses. The palace's sources, briefed to the press in the hours following the Oprah broadcast, said that the reverse was true, that Meghan had made Kate cry. The competing claims were covered as the he said, she said of a family dispute, which is the framing that serves the institution by converting a question about the institution's management of its members into a question about two women's behavior toward each other. What the record supports, assembled from the accounts of palace insiders in the biographies that examined the period, is that the relationship between Kate and Meghan was from its beginning organized around the specific tensions that the institution produces between senior members and incoming members. The incoming members' unfamiliarity with the institution's requirements, the senior members' role in communicating those requirements, and the specific quality of friction that develops when the incoming member finds the requirements unreasonable and the senior member finds the friction a challenge to the institution's management of both of them. The tears may have flowed in any direction on any given occasion. What the record most clearly establishes is that the institution's management of the relationship was the management of two women in positions of unequal institutional seniority, and that the management consistently prioritized the institutional hierarchy over the personal comfort of either party, and that Kate's position at the top of that hierarchy was the position that the decade of preparation had been building toward. The preparation and its outcomes produced by 2019 what the palace's senior staff described in the accounts that reached the biographers as the most complete senior female royal in living memory, a woman who performed the public role with the specific competence that training produces when the training has been long enough and serious enough to internalize the role's requirements as the performer's own, rather than as requirements imposed from outside. The distinction is the distinction between the person who is performing the role and the person who has become it, and Kate, by 2019, had become it in the specific sense that the performance required no visible effort. The role and the person had, across 8 years of continuous practice, become the same thing. What nobody inside or outside the institution had planned for was the medical event of January 2023, because medical events of that kind are not the things that strategies produce or that managements can anticipate, and the medical event, when it arrived, produced the most significant test of the Middleton strategy's outcome that the strategy had faced since the courtship itself. The test was not the test of whether the strategy had produced a princess. It had. The test was the test of whether the strategy had produced a person who could survive what the princess now had to survive, which was a public medical situation managed inside an institution that had specific and non-negotiable requirements about what could be disclosed and when and in what form, at a moment when the person inside the situation needed something that the institution's requirements did not make easily available. What she needed, and what the institution provided and failed to provide in equal measure across the months that followed, is the subject that Part 9 addresses through the specific record of what happened between January and March 2024, when Kate told the world what the world had been speculating about for 14 weeks, and the telling produced the most significant reappraisal of the institution's management of its members since the weeks following Diana's death in August 1997. On the 17th of January 2024, the Princess of Wales was admitted to the London Clinic in Marylebone for what Kensington Palace described, in a statement issued the same day, as planned abdominal surgery. The statement said the surgery had been successful. It said the princess was likely to remain in hospital for 10 to 14 days. It said she had asked for privacy for herself and her family during her recovery period, and that further updates would be provided in due course. The statement contained 4 sentences. The 4 sentences were the entirety of what the palace was prepared to disclose about the medical situation of the woman who was, by that point, the most publicly visible member of the royal family after the king, and the 4 sentences produced, in the specific media environment of January 2024, exactly the opposite of what the palace intended them to produce. The palace intended them to produce a period of respectful silence, organized around the specific principle that the princess had requested privacy and that the press and the public would honor the request because the request had been made. The principle had organized the palace's communications strategy around royal medical situations since the managed silences of the 20th century, when the health of the sovereign and the senior royals was a matter for the institution's communications apparatus rather than for the public record, and when the press, organized around a different relationship with the palace than the relationship that 2024 required, operated within the framework that the palace constructed around its members' private lives. The framework had not been updated to account for the specific media environment of January 2024, which was an environment in which the palace's statement was the beginning of a story rather than the management of one, because the statement provided insufficient information to satisfy the specific curiosity that the absence of information generates in a media ecosystem organized around the production and consumption of information about famous people at the fastest possible speed across the largest possible number of platforms simultaneously. The 14 days became 14 weeks, and the 14 weeks became the most discussed period of royal absence since the week following Diana's death in 1997. And the discussion was not the discussion the palace had planned for, because the palace had not planned for the discussion at all. The specific quality of the absence that generated the discussion was the quality of an absence that did not end when the palace said it would end. The 10 to 14 days in hospital passed. Kate was discharged and was said to be recovering at Windsor. The recovery continued. The engagements that had been scheduled for February were postponed. The engagements that had been scheduled for March were postponed. The palace's updates, such as they were, arrived in the form of statements that confirmed the recovery was progressing and that the princess would return to public duties when she was medically able, and the statements were the statements of an institution that had decided the least said was the most manageable, and that was discovering, in real time, that the calculation had been made in a media environment that no longer existed. The speculation began within weeks of the surgery and accelerated across February and into March, in the specific way that speculation accelerates in the absence of information, which is by filling the information vacuum with the material that the platforms incentivize: theories, interpretations, the reading of available images for signals that the available images had not been designed to provide. Kate had not been seen in public since Christmas Day, when she had attended the Sandringham church service with the family, and the absence of any confirmed public sighting across the weeks of January and February produced in the online ecosystem the specific phenomenon of the celebrity disappearance narrative, in which the absence becomes the story, and the story generates the theories, and the theories generate the engagement, and the engagement generates more theories, in a cycle that the absence sustains indefinitely. The palace's response to the speculation was the response it had applied to the surgery announcement: managed silence, occasional statements confirming the recovery was ongoing, and the specific quality of institutional composure that the palace applies to situations it has decided it will not address more fully than the minimum requires. The composure was genuine, in the sense that the people operating the palace's communications machinery believed the approach was correct, and it was also, from the perspective of the media environment in which it was operating, a miscalculation of the specific kind that institutions make when their model of the world has not been updated to account for the world that has replaced it. The photograph arrived on the 10th of March 2024, Mother's Day in the United Kingdom, and it was the moment at which the palace's management of the situation ceased to be a management problem and became a crisis. Kensington Palace released an image of Kate with her 3 children, seated outdoors, smiling, the image of family warmth that the Mother's Day occasion required, and that the palace had clearly prepared as the first public confirmation that the princess was recovering well enough to be photographed with her children in a domestic setting. The image was released to the wire agencies that distribute royal photographs to publications globally, and within hours the agencies were doing something they had not done to a Kensington Palace photograph in living memory. They were pulling it. The Associated Press, Getty Images, Reuters, and AFP each issued what the news industry calls a kill notice, withdrawing the photograph from distribution on the grounds that the image appeared to have been manipulated in ways that violated the agency's editorial standards. The specific manipulations identified by the agency's photo editors, trained professionals whose job is the detection of exactly this kind of alteration, included inconsistencies in the alignment of Princess Charlotte's sleeve that indicated a portion of the image had been moved or altered after the original frame was taken. The kill notices were themselves the story, because the kill notice of a royal official photograph was an event without precedent in the agency's relationship with the palace, and the event produced coverage that the original photograph, had it been accepted and distributed without incident, would not have produced. Kate issued a statement that same afternoon, through Kensington Palace, apologizing for any confusion caused and acknowledging that she, like many amateur photographers, occasionally experiments with editing. The statement was the statement of a person who had made a personal decision about the presentation of a family photograph in the same way that any parent makes decisions about family photographs shared on personal platforms, and had not fully understood that the same decision applied to a photograph released through royal wire services to the global press carried institutional implications that personal social media sharing did not. The statement was also, and this is the dimension that the coverage found most significant, the first statement the princess had made in her own voice since the surgery announcement in January, and the voice was the voice of someone who was apologizing rather than explaining, and the apology generated the specific response that apologies without full explanations generate in media environments organized around the pursuit of the full explanation. The speculation intensified. The conspiracy theories that the online ecosystem had been generating since January acquired the specific energy that a credibility problem provides. The institution had released a manipulated image, and the manipulation, however innocuous its stated cause, was the proof that the ecosystem had been looking for, that the official account of the princess's situation was not the full account. The specific theories that circulated in the days following the photograph's withdrawal do not require cataloguing in this account, because the theories were theories rather than evidence, and their content was organized around the specific logic of the conspiracy theory, which is the logic that converts the absence of information into the proof of concealment rather than the demonstration of privacy. What requires cataloguing is the effect. The effect was that the palace's management of the situation had produced, by the second week of March 2024, the precise opposite of the managed quiet that the January statement had been designed to achieve. The story was larger in the second week of March than it had been in January. The coverage was more global, more speculative, and more damaging to the institution's credibility than any amount of transparency about the medical situation would have produced. Because the credibility damage came not from the medical situation itself, but from the management of the information around it, and the management had proceeded on the assumption that an institution's claim to privacy was sufficient to produce the privacy it claimed, in a media environment where the claim was one input among many and the many others were not organized around the institution's preferences. William appeared at a farm shop in Windsor on the 11th of March, the day after the photograph's withdrawal, in a footage that was clearly not staged, but that was also clearly released because the footage was useful. And the footage was useful because it showed a senior royal in a normal domestic setting doing a normal domestic thing, which was the visual information that the absence of visual information had made the media most eager to receive. The footage was received with the combination of relief and analysis that confirmed its specific function. It was the visual evidence that the normal life was continuing, released at the moment when the evidence of the normal life was most needed. Kate's own appearance came on the 22nd of March 2024 in a filmed statement recorded in the garden of the Windsor residence that the family occupied, and the statement was the statement that the 14 weeks of management had been building toward, without the management having designed it as a destination. It was not the statement that the palace's communications framework would have produced, because the palace's framework would have produced the minimum disclosure at the maximum delay, and the statement delivered on the 22nd of March was not the minimum disclosure. It disclosed a cancer diagnosis. It disclosed that the cancer had been discovered during the January surgery, that further investigations had confirmed the diagnosis, and that she was undertaking a course of preventative chemotherapy. It disclosed, in the specific register of a person choosing their own words, rather than the institution's, the emotional texture of the months of the diagnosis and the treatment decisions, the shock, the disbelief, the desire to shield the children from the information until she and William had processed it themselves and been advised about when and how to tell them. The statement was watched globally, in the hours and days following its release, by hundreds of millions of people across every platform on which video content is distributed, and the response it generated was the response that genuine human disclosure generates when the person making the disclosure is someone whose public identity has been managed with sufficient care across a sufficient number of years that the management itself becomes visible at the moment it ceases to operate. The care that had organized every public appearance across the 13 years since the wedding was visible in its absence. The woman in the garden, without the institutional frame that every preceding public appearance had provided, was the person rather than the performance, and the response to the person was the response that the management of the performance across 13 years had built without designing. Carole was at the Windsor residence during the recovery. The accounts of her role in those months, assembled from the sources close to the family that the press coverage drew on, were the accounts of the woman who had always been the family's operational center, demonstrating the quality that the whole Middleton project had been built on, which was the quality of someone who identifies what the situation requires and provides it without requiring acknowledgement of the provision. She collected the children from school. She managed the domestic logistics of a household organized around a recovering principle. She was there, in the specific way that she had always been there across the 30 years of the project, in the rooms that the cameras did not enter and the statements did not describe, doing the work that the project required. The cancer announcement reorganized the public understanding of Kate Middleton in the specific way that genuine disclosure always reorganizes public understanding. It replaced the version of the person that the management had produced with the person that the management had been managing on behalf of, and the two versions were substantially the same and substantially different in exactly the proportions that 13 years of professional management and one filmed garden statement produce. The professional version had been impeccable. The garden version was human. The response confirmed what the professional version had built. An audience that had spent 13 years being managed had also spent 13 years genuinely caring about the person the management was managing. And the caring was the thing that no amount of strategic planning had produced, or could have produced, because it was the response to the person, rather than to the strategy. What the person had become, and what the strategy had made possible, and what the person had made of the possibility, is the subject that the following parts of this account address, through the specific record of what Kate Middleton brought to the institution from the family that had placed her inside it, and what the institution made of what she brought, and whether the exchange, viewed from the distance of 23 years since the University of St Andrews fashion show, and the front row ticket, and the remark to Fergus Boyd, produced anything that the woman in the garden in March 2024 would have recognized as the outcome the Berkshire kitchen had been working toward. The exchange that the Middleton strategy produced, assessed from the distance of 23 years and the specific vantage point of the March 2024 garden statement, was not the exchange that the strategy had been designed to produce, because strategies designed across decades produce outcomes that the design cannot fully anticipate, and the outcome that the design produced in this case was larger and more complicated and more human than the kitchen table in Bradfield Southend in 1987 had been working toward. The kitchen table had been working toward a princess. The garden statement produced a person, and the difference between the two is the difference between what the strategy designed and what the strategy delivered. And the delivery is more interesting than the design, because the design is the story that the strategic reading of the Middleton family has always told, and the delivery is the story that the design was covering. Begin with what Kate brought to the institution, because the strategic reading has always underweighted this dimension, organizing itself around the calculation of what the institution could give the Middletons, and leaving under-examined the question of what the Middletons gave the institution in return. The institution received, in April 2011, a woman of 30 who had spent a decade preparing for a role that the institution had not designed, but that the woman's preparation had made her specifically suited for, and the suitability was not the suitability of social credentialing or family connection. It was the suitability of character, and the character had been formed not by the institution's own processes, but by the Middleton families, which were different from the institutions in ways that the institution found initially uncomfortable and subsequently indispensable. The Middleton formation, assembled from what this account has traced across the preceding 9 parts, had produced in Kate a specific combination of qualities that the institution's own formation had never reliably produced in the people it had formed from inside. The groundedness that comes from a family organized around work rather than around position. The specific quality of warmth toward people outside the institution's social world that the institution had always found professionally difficult to generate in the members it raised inside its own culture. The resilience that working-class origins 2 generations back produce in families that have not forgotten them, and the emotional intelligence that the Carole formation had developed across 30 years of reading rooms and managing social situations and understanding what the person across the table actually needed, rather than what the occasion required her to need. These qualities were not the qualities that the vetting process had been designed to measure, because the vetting process was organized around the assessment of risk rather than the assessment of value, and the qualities that made Kate valuable to the institution were not the qualities that the risk assessment framework was designed to identify as value. The courtiers who had worried about the doors to manual and the strategic positioning and the Gary Goldsmith problem had been measuring the family against the institution's established framework for the assessment of suitability, and the framework's categories were the categories of class and connection and background, and in those categories, the Middleton family presented complications that the framework registered as concerns. What the framework was not measuring was the specific quality of a woman who had spent 10 years learning the institution from outside and who understood, as a result, what the institution looked like to the people who were not inside it, which was exactly the understanding that the institution most needed and had least consistently possessed in its senior female members across the preceding half-century. Diana had had it in abundance and had been destroyed by the gap between the understanding and the institution's capacity to accommodate what the understanding produced. Sarah Ferguson had had it in her own register and had been expelled when her use of it exceeded the institutional framework's tolerance. Kate had it and had, across 13 years, deployed it within the institutional framework rather than against it, and the deployment within rather than against was the specific quality of political intelligence that the preceding decade had developed in her, and that the institution had received as the most valuable single asset any of its members had provided since the Queen herself. The early childhood platform is the clearest available measure of the exchange's value from the institution's side, because it is the platform that the institution did not design and that Kate brought to it from the specific combination of her Middleton formation and her own intellectual development inside the role. The platform's intellectual coherence, the engagement with the developmental psychology research, the Center for Early Childhood's genuinely rigorous programmatic output, reflected a quality of sustained intellectual engagement with a subject that the institution had not asked for and had not prepared her to produce. It was the product of a woman who had been given a platform and had decided to use it for something that the platform's authority could serve, rather than merely decorate. And the deciding was the product of a formation that the institution's own culture would not have produced, because the institution's culture had always organized its members' charitable and policy interests around the social world the institution inhabited, rather than around the evidence base that the research Kate engaged with represented. The Royal Foundation Centre for Early Childhood, established in 2021, produced in its first 3 years of operation a body of work that academics in the developmental psychology field described, in terms that this account is drawing on from the published assessments of the centre's output, as substantively serious rather than merely symbolic. The research commissions, the policy papers, the practitioner training programs, the public awareness campaigns organized around the science of early brain development represented an institutional investment in a policy area that the charitable and philanthropic sector had identified as underfunded, and that the Royal Foundation's involvement had elevated in the public conversation in the specific way that royal patronage elevates things when the patronage is genuine rather than ceremonial. The genuineness was what the platform produced, and the genuineness came from the person rather than from the institution, and the person came from Berkshire rather than from the palace. And the Berkshire formation was the formation that the institution had found uncomfortable and that had turned out, across 13 years, to be the institution's most significant recent acquisition. What the exchange cost Kate is the dimension that the strategic reading has consistently underweighted, because the strategic reading is organized around what the strategy produced, rather than around what the production cost the person at its center, and the cost is the cost that this account has been assembling from the available evidence across the parts that have examined the institutional experience from inside. The cost was the cost of the performance, extended across 13 years without adequate private counterweight. Kate had prepared for the role with a discipline that the role required, and the preparation had produced a performer of exceptional competence. But the competence of the performer does not resolve the cost of the performance, which is the cost that every person who performs a demanding public role continuously across a long period pays in the specific currency of the private self that the performance consumes. The private self exists alongside the performance, in the rooms that the cameras do not enter and the statements do not describe, and the evidence of its existence in Kate's case is the evidence that the March 2024 statement provided: the shock, the disbelief, the desire to protect the children, the human texture of a response that the management framework would have organized differently if the management framework had been in control. It had not been in control of the cancer, which is the obvious statement of a biological fact, but it is also the statement of something less obvious, that the cancer, and the specific manner of its disclosure, was the first event in Kate's public life since the wedding that the management framework had been unable to manage in the direction of the framework's preferences. Every preceding event, the children's births, the charitable engagements, the Meghan situation, the COVID period, the Earthshot Prize, the state visits, had been managed within the framework with the competence that the preparation had produced. The cancer was outside the framework's reach, and the statement that emerged from outside the framework's reach was the most viewed piece of content that Kensington Palace had ever produced, and the most human, and the response it generated was the response that the human content had built across 13 years of managed competence, which was an audience that had learned to trust the management and discovered, in the garden statement, the person the management had been managing on behalf of. Carole's exchange was the exchange that this account has been tracing from the Durham coal mines to the Kensington Palace garden. She had designed an ascent, and the ascent had succeeded, and the success had produced a Princess of Wales, who was, by the assessment of the palace insiders, whose accounts the biographies drew on, the institution's most credible and most valued senior female member in living memory. The success had also produced the party pieces administration, the Gary Goldsmith problem, the Pippa situation, the James Depression, the specific costs that the strategy had distributed across the family members who were not the strategy's primary subject, and who had paid for their proximity to the subject in the currencies of commercial failure and public scrutiny, and the specific variety of exposure that royal adjacency produces in people who have not been prepared for it. The net of the exchange, set against everything this account has assembled, is not straightforwardly positive or negative in any of the frameworks the coverage has applied to it. The strategic reading finds a ruthless family that deployed a daughter for social advancement and succeeded at the deployment. The romantic reading finds a love story that happened to occur between a prince and a woman whose family had positioned her advantageously. The institutional reading finds the palace receiving a member of exceptional quality from a background it had not historically valued, and benefiting from the qualities that the unvalued background produced. All three readings are supported by portions of the evidence. None of them is supported by all of it. What all of the evidence supports is the account of a woman who was, whatever else the story of her arrival contains, the specific right person for the specific moment in the institution's history that her arrival coincided with. The institution needed someone who understood it from outside. It received someone who had spent 10 years understanding it from outside. The institution needed someone who could perform its requirements with the specific quality of warmth that makes the performance invisible to the people receiving it. It received someone whose formation had developed exactly that quality across 30 years of the family that produced her. The institution needed someone who could survive what the role required without being destroyed by it, which is the need the institution had not successfully met since the Queen herself, and the need whose meeting is still being assessed because the assessment requires the full arc, and the full arc is not yet complete. Michael Middleton's grandmother stood in a procession in Leeds in 1927, behind Princess Mary, the guest of honour, in the procession of the Yorkshire establishment that had been in the monarchy's social world for generations. Carole Goldsmith grew up in a terraced house in Southall, the daughter of a decorator and a jewellery shop assistant, the great-granddaughter of a Durham coal miner. Their children stood beside each other at the altar of a parish church in Buckinghamshire in 1980, and their granddaughter stood beside the future King of England at the altar of Westminster Abbey in 2011, and their great-grandchildren are second, third, and fourth in line to the throne. The distance the family travelled in 3 generations is the distance that England's class system permits to be travelled when the travelling is done with sufficient intelligence and sufficient patience and sufficient understanding of what the terrain requires. Whether the travel was ruthless or brilliant or simply the most thorough expression of the parental instinct that any generation of the Middleton family produced is the question that the evidence permits each reader to answer according to what the evidence, read whole, seems to them most to demonstrate. The evidence is what this account has assembled. The reading is what the reader provides, and the reading will be shaped, inevitably, by which parts of the account the reader finds most recognizable: the kitchen table or the crown, the Durham pit or the Westminster Abbey aisle, the strategy or the love story, the management or the garden. Both are in the record, both are true. The gap between them is the gap that this account has been measuring from its first sentence, and the measurement produces not a verdict but a distance, and the distance is what the Middleton family travelled across 3 generations, from everything it was to everything it became, and the travelling is the story that neither the strategic reading nor the romantic one has ever quite managed to hold whole. In September 2022, 5 days after the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the new King Charles III formally conferred on his daughter-in-law the title of Princess of Wales. The conferral was announced in a statement from Buckingham Palace that was, like all such statements, organised around the minimum language necessary to convey the maximum institutional significance, and the minimum language was sufficient because the maximum institutional significance was legible to anyone who understood what the title represented and what the family that received it had come from. The Princess of Wales was the title that Diana had held. It was the title that the nation's most powerful emotional attachment to the modern monarchy had organized itself around, across 30 years of grief and documentary and dramatization, and the conferral of it on a woman whose mother had been a flight attendant, and whose great-great-grandfather had worked Durham coal seams, was the institution's most complete single acknowledgement that the doors to manual assessment of the Middleton family had been revised, comprehensively, in the direction of its opposite. The revision had taken 21 years, from the first coverage of William and Kate's St Andrews relationship in 2001 to the Accession Day statement in September 2022, and the trajectory of the revision, traced through the palace insiders whose assessments reached the biographers across those years, is the trajectory of an institution discovering, 1 decade at a time, that the thing it had found uncomfortable about the family it was receiving was the thing that made the family valuable. The discovery was not announced. Institutions do not announce the revision of their prejudices. They perform the revision through the conferral of titles and the management of coverage, and the specific quality of the warmth they direct toward the people the revision has been made about. And the warmth, once it arrived in the palace's treatment of the Middletons, was the warmth of an institution that had completed its assessment and found in favor of the assessed. The completing of the assessment happened in stages, and the stages correspond roughly to the decades of the relationship. The first decade, from 2001 to 2011, was the decade of discomfort, the courtiers who used the word ruthless, the William friends who made the doors to manual remark at bougies, the vetting that found the complications this account has catalogued and produced the private assessments that the biographies drew on. The discomfort was real, and it was shared across the senior household, and it organized the palace's management of the courtship in the specific direction of an institution that was observing a situation it had not designed and could not fully control, and was applying to it the management techniques of an institution that had always responded to situations it could not control by observing them more carefully. The observation produced the first revision, which arrived in the second decade, from 2011 to 2021, and which was the revision that the performance of the role produced in the people watching the performance. Kate's engagement with the early childhood research, her management of the Meghan situation without the public rupture that the situation might have generated, her production of 3 children who were by every account of the people who observed the family in those years, being raised with a specific quality of normality that the institution found both surprising and valuable, her management of the COVID period, during which both she and William conducted a sustained program of community engagement that the palace's communications operation subsequently identified as among the most effective public relations work the institution had produced in a decade. All of this was the evidence base from which the second revision was made, and the revision moved the internal assessment from the discomfort of the first decade to something the people conducting the assessment were more comfortable expressing as approval. The approval was not uniform. Charles's evolving view of Kate across the years of the marriage was tracked by the biographers in terms that described a shift from the wary interest of the pre-wedding period to the warmth that the post-wedding years produced in a man who had watched his eldest son build a family that had the specific quality of functional stability that Charles's own first family had catastrophically lacked. The functional stability was partly Kate's production, in the specific sense that the management of a family's internal life in the conditions of royal visibility requires the person most engaged with that management to possess qualities that Charles had observed in Kate from the beginning, and that the years had confirmed: the patience, the discretion, the specific quality of emotional steadiness that the role required, and that his own formation and his son's formation had not consistently provided. He spoke about Kate, in the accounts of people who discussed her with him across the post-wedding decade, with a warmth that the pre-wedding assessment had not predicted, and the warmth was the warmth of someone who had revised their judgment in the light of evidence that the judgment had not anticipated. The specific courtiers whose views had organized the first decade's discomfort had, by the second decade, either left the household through the natural attrition of institutional change or had revised their assessments in the direction that the evidence required. The Tina Brown sources who described the first decade's palace atmosphere in the Palace Papers, published in 2022, described an institution that had moved from the class anxiety of the courtship period to something Brown organized around the phrase earned acceptance, which is the phrase that institutions apply to the revision of a prejudice when the revision is supported by evidence sufficient to justify the original prejudice's abandonment. The earned acceptance was the acceptance that 13 years of the role's performance had produced, and its earning was the specific measure of what the exchange had cost Kate in the years between the wedding and the Princess of Wales conferral. The Princess of Wales title carried its own specific weight beyond the institutional acknowledgement it represented, because the title carried Diana, and Diana carried the specific emotional history of the nation's relationship with the monarchy across the 30 years since her death, and the management of the title's inheritance was the most delicate communications challenge that the palace had faced in a generation. William understood the challenge from the inside, as the person who had grown up inside it, and the manner in which Kate wore the title in the months following its conferral, the specific quality of the public engagement that the Princess of Wales role produced from her in the autumn of 2022 and through 2023, before the cancer arrived and changed everything, was the manner of someone who understood what the title carried and had decided to carry it in her own register rather than in Diana's. The own register is the piece of the legacy question that the strategic reading of the Middleton family has always been least equipped to address, because the strategic reading is organized around the destination, and the own register is the quality that the destination cannot produce. It is produced by the person, and the person is not the strategy's product, even when the strategy placed the person in the position where the quality became visible. Kate's register, assembled from the accounts of the people who have worked with her across the years of the role, is the register of someone who has made the institution's requirements her own, rather than performing them as external impositions, and the making of the requirements into one's own is the deepest form of institutional integration, and the one that the institution values most, because it produces the sustainability that performance cannot sustain indefinitely. The sustainability was tested by the cancer, and the testing produced the evidence that this account examined in Part 9, which was the evidence of a person whose integration of the role was sufficiently complete that the role survived the testing even when the performance of it could not continue. The garden statement was the evidence of the integration's depth. The woman speaking in it was speaking in the register of the institution, while also speaking in the register of herself, and the two registers were not in tension with each other because the years had made them the same register, and the making of them the same register was what 13 years of the specific kind of preparation this account has traced had produced. George, Charlotte, and Louis are the dimension of the legacy question that the strategic reading has not examined, because the strategic reading ends with the wedding, and the strategic reading's subject is Carole's design, and George, Charlotte, and Louis are not the design's product. They are Kate's product, formed inside the institution, but by a parent who brought to their formation the Middleton qualities that this account has identified as the institution's most significant recent acquisition. The accounts of the children across the years of their visible public life, limited by the specific protection that both their parents have applied to their exposure to public attention, describe children who are in the specific sense of the word normal, that royal children are rarely described as normal, which is the sense of being able to exist in ordinary spaces with ordinary people, without the performance of royalty that the institution has always required of its members from the earliest visible age. The normality is Kate's production, and it is the Middleton formation's bequest to the generation that follows. Carole's coal-mining great-great-grandfather did not read the institutions of England from inside them. He read them from the coal face, which is the most complete outside view that the English class system has ever produced, and the reading passed forward through Dorothy's jewelry shop and Ronald's decorating business, and Carol's party bags, and Kate's history of art lectures, to the three children in the Windsor residence who are being raised with the specific combination of institutional weight and civilian warmth that the Middleton formation, across 4 generations of its development, was always moving toward, without knowing that this was where it was going. What comes after is not the strategy's territory. The strategy was designed to produce a princess, and it produced one, and the princess produced children, and the children are the next generation of the institution that the strategy inserted the family into, and the institution will form the children in the ways that institutions form people, and what the children make of the formation, is the question that only the children's lives can answer, and the lives have not yet produced the evidence. What they have produced is the beginning of it, in the accounts of the children at the school events and the Christmas services and the public appearances that the palace permits, and the beginning suggests the quality that this account has been tracking across its length, which is the quality of people who are inside the institution, but not entirely of it, who carry the institutional weight without being entirely defined by it, who are, in the specific sense that their mother's formation produced in her, capable of standing in the garden and speaking in their own voice when the performance has reached the point at which the performance is no longer the most important thing. The most important thing is what the garden statement said it was, which is the human thing that the strategy had always been working toward and had arrived at by a different route than the strategy had designed. The strategy had designed a princess. The princess had made a person across 13 years of the role's demands, and the person had made children, and the children were being made into people rather than into princesses, and the making of people rather than princesses is the Middleton contribution to the institution that the doors to manual crowd in the Bougee's nightclub in 2006 had not been in a position to anticipate. The anticipation belongs to this account's closing parts. What they address is the question that the whole account has been building toward, which is not the question of whether the Middleton strategy was ruthless, because it was, and not whether it was brilliant, because it was, but whether the ruthlessness and the brilliance produce something that the institution and the family and the person at the strategy's center would each, from their respective positions, identify as worth what it cost. In the spring of 2019, a story appeared in the British press that the palace did not comment on, and the not commenting was itself the comment, because Kensington Palace had, the previous year, issued a rare public statement about a story it judged false enough to deny, and the absence of the same statement about this story told the people who understood how the palace communicated what the presence of the statement had not been required to say. The story, first published by The Sun, and then picked up across the British and American tabloid press in a wave that the palace's silence made impossible to manage, concerned Rose Hanbury, the Marchioness of Cholmondeley, a former model and Norfolk landowner who lived with her husband David Rocksavage, the 7th Marquess of Cholmondeley, at Houghton Hall, one of the great houses of Norfolk, a few miles from William and Kate's Norfolk home at Anmere Hall. The story alleged that William had conducted an affair with Rose, that Kate had discovered it, and that Kate had subsequently demanded that Rose be phased out of the couple's social circle. The story was sourced to unnamed insiders. It was specific about the falling out between the two women. It was vague about the nature of the alleged relationship between William and Rose, in the way that stories of this category are vague when their specificity cannot be documented. William's attorneys contacted the Daily Beast in the days following the story's publication and stated that the speculation about his relationship with Rose was false and highly damaging. The statement was a legal communication rather than a public statement, delivered through the channel that legal communications use when the institution wants the denial on record, without the public statement generating the additional coverage that a public statement would produce. It was, by the standards of royal denials, as close to a direct denial as William's position permitted, and it was not the denial of the specific allegation of an affair, but of the speculation, which is a meaningful distinction in the vocabulary of legal communications, where the word chosen is chosen with precision. Rose's own lawyers stated, in March 2024, when the story resurfaced during the 14-week absence coverage, that the rumors were completely false. The statement was issued through legal channels rather than public communications, in the same register as William's attorney's communication, and the register was the register of people who are denying something through the mechanism that minimizes the attention the denial generates, while still entering the denial into the record. The record of what was denied coexists, in the public account, with the record of what was not denied, and the not denied is the piece of the story that neither William's attorneys nor Rose's lawyers addressed. What was not denied was the falling out between Kate and Rose. The Sun's original story, which described the two women as rural rivals who had been close friends and had subsequently had a falling out that was connected to the speculation about William, was not denied by the palace, in the form of the specific statement the palace had issued the previous year about a different story. In 2018, when the Sun's Dan Wootton had reported that Kate had slapped down Meghan and told her not to berate members of Kate's staff, Kensington Palace had issued a statement that said simply, "This never happened." The clarity of those 3 words, and their deployment in 2018, provided a benchmark against which the absence of the same 3 words in 2019 was itself a communication. Kate was described by sources who reached the tabloid coverage of the period as devastated by the rumours. The word is the word that tabloid sources apply to royal principals whose emotional states they are interpreting through second-hand information, and it carries the appropriate degree of caution. What the same sources described, with slightly more specificity, was that the couple had entered counselling in the period when the rumours were most intense, which would have been the spring and summer of 2019, and that the counselling reflected the specific quality of a marriage under the pressure that an allegation of infidelity generates in a public relationship of the specific kind that William and Kate's marriage had always been, which is a relationship whose every development occurs in the presence of an audience that has been following it since 2001, and that has an investment in its continuation that the principals can neither ignore nor fully manage. The David Rock-Savage dimension of the story is the dimension that the tabloid coverage handled least carefully and that the public record handles most cleanly, because it is documented without ambiguity. David Rock-Savage, Rose's husband, is one of King Charles's lords-in-waiting, a hereditary court appointment whose holder attends the sovereign at state occasions and whose family has maintained the specific proximity to the crown that the Cholmondeley title and the Houghton Hall estate represent. His son Oliver served as one of King Charles's pages at the coronation in May 2023. Rose herself attended the coronation, seated among the congregation, and the attendance was interpreted by the press in 2 opposite directions, as evidence that the rumours had never been substantial enough to warrant her exclusion from the royal occasion, or as evidence that the institution had managed the situation into the specific accommodation that its management produces, when the alternative accommodation would require a public acknowledgement that the institution is not prepared to make. The coronation attendance produced its own coverage wave when photographers captured Rose in the congregation and the internet identified her, and the coverage of the identification generated the specific reaction that the Rose story always generates, which is the reaction of an audience that has been following the story since 2019 and that interprets every subsequent piece of visual evidence through the frame that the 2019 story established. Kate and Rose's attendance at the same coronation, in the same building, in the same ceremony, was covered as a moment of significance that it may or may not have been, and the may or may not is the condition in which the whole story exists, because the documents that would resolve the may or may not are the documents that nobody has produced and that the legal communications have not made available. Andrew Lowney, the biographer whose examination of the Windsor family's private records has produced the most specific sourced claims about the marriage's difficulties, reported through his sources that Kate had issued William an ultimatum in the period of the rumour's intensity: "It's her or me, make up your mind." The claim is Lowney's, drawn from his sources, and it is offered here in the register that this account applies to sourced but unconfirmed claims, as the most specific available account of Kate's response to the situation, from a biographer whose sourcing has elsewhere in this account been confirmed by other evidence. Whether the ultimatum was delivered in the words Lowney's source used, or in the substance that the words describe, or in the atmosphere that the period produced without any single verbal confrontation, the outcome that the subsequent record describes is the outcome of a marriage that was, by the autumn of 2019, conducting itself in public with the specific quality of a couple who had navigated something difficult and had arrived at the decision to continue in a form that the continuation required them not to discuss. The not discussing is the final piece of the Norfolk neighbour story, and it is the piece that places it most precisely in the context of the Middleton strategy that this account has been examining, because the not discussing was Kate's choice, and the choice was consistent with the formation that every preceding part of this account has documented. A woman who had spent a decade learning to present the version of a situation that the situation required had the specific capacity to present, in 2019 and in all the years following, the version of a marriage that the marriage's public continuation required. regardless of what the private version contained. The capacity was the Middleton formation's deepest product, and its deployment in 2019 was the deployment of a quality that the kitchen table in 1987 had not designed for this specific situation, and that had turned out to be exactly suited to it. What Kate's biographer Robert Jobson documented, in his 2024 account drawing on Palace Insiders, was that before the wedding, Kate had presented her fundamental life rules to both the Queen and Prince Charles, that her family would always come first, that she would not be pigeonholed into specific duties, and that the marriage would be organized around the priorities she established, rather than around the institution's convenience. The presentation of those terms, before the wedding, to the sovereign and the heir, is the document of a woman who had understood the institution's tendency to consume its members and had negotiated the terms of her membership before accepting it. The negotiation was the Middleton formation's most sophisticated product, not the elocution lessons or the Edinburgh switch or the fashion show ticket, but the specific moment at which the woman who had spent a decade managing her approach to the institution sat across from its two most powerful members and told them what her membership required. The institution accepted the terms. The acceptance was the measure of what the preparation had produced. A woman whom the institution needed enough to accept the terms she set. And the terms, set in 2011 and maintained across the years since, including the years of the Norfolk neighbour story and the 14 weeks of absence and the garden statement, were the terms of a woman who had understood from the beginning that the survival of the person inside the institution required the specific protection of the person's own priorities against the institution's demands, and who had secured that protection before the demands arrived. The Norfolk neighbour story is in the public record, in the form the public record contains it, denied by the people who were positioned to deny it, unresolved by the documents that would have resolved it, and managed by Kate in the manner that the formation had equipped her to manage it, which is the manner of someone who has decided that the public version of a situation is the version the situation requires, and who possesses, from 30 years of watching her mother do the same thing in a different register, the specific discipline to maintain the public version against the pressure of the private one. What the Norfolk neighbour story and the Meghan situation and the cancer and the 14 weeks together tell about the marriage is the subject that Part 13 addresses, through the account of what a royal marriage in the specific conditions of perpetual public attention actually contains, and what it costs the people inside it, and what they have to become in order to survive inside it, and whether survival is the right word for what they become. In January 2007, Prince William ended his relationship with Kate Middleton in a 30-minute phone call. Robert Jobson, drawing on sources close to both parties for his 2024 biography, described the call in terms that the romantic account of the courtship has always preferred to treat as a temporary interruption rather than as the evidence it actually is. Evidence that the man Kate would eventually marry was capable of ending a 5-year relationship over the telephone, that the ending left Kate, in Jobson's sources' words, devastated and confused, and that the specific manner of the ending, the phone rather than the face, told something about the dynamic of the relationship that the subsequent years of the marriage have confirmed rather than contradicted. The dynamic was the dynamic of a relationship organized around William's comfort rather than around the mutual discomfort of two people who have decided to take each other's feelings equally seriously, and the organization of the relationship around William's comfort was the organization that the institution had always imposed on the relationships of its heirs, and that Kate had accepted, before the breakup and after it, as the operating condition of the marriage she was entering. The phone call was not the only piece of documentary evidence for the dynamic's existence. Jobson also recorded, from his palace sources, that Kate had arrived at the reconciliation with a specific quality of resolve that the preceding years of the courtship had not required her to display. She had delivered, in the period of the reconciliation, what the sources described as an ultimatum, not in the form of an explicit demand, but in the form of the first direct expression of her own requirements that the relationship had produced. She told William, in the substance of what the sources preserved, that she was miserable but not desperate, and that she had nothing to lose, and that for the first time she was relaying her true feelings rather than managing her presentation of them. The relaying of the true feelings was the moment at which the Middleton formation's decade of management produced its most significant departure from its own method, and the departure produced the engagement, which is the evidence that the departure was effective. What the phone call and the ultimatum together tell about the marriage that followed is the thing that the accounts of the marriage's private texture consistently return to across the biographies and the palace insider accounts that the biographies drew on. That the marriage was, from its earliest stages, organized around the specific tension between two people of substantial individual will operating inside an institution that imposed its own will on both of them, and that the management of that tension was the primary private activity of the marriage, alongside the public activities that the institution required. The managing was Kate's speciality, by the formation this account has documented, and the managing was what the marriage's survival across the years of the Norfolk neighbour story and the Meghan situation and the cancer required. And the survival is the evidence that the managing worked, without the working of it producing the outcome that the management of a marriage normally produces, which is the resolution of the tension rather than its sustained accommodation. The Meghan situation arrived in 2017 and required a different category of management from the management that the preceding 6 years had developed Kate's capacity for, because the previous 6 years had required the management of external pressures on the marriage, the press, the public expectations, the institutional demands, and the Meghan situation required the management of an internal pressure, the pressure of a new family member whose relationship with Kate's husband and whose relationship with Kate's position inside the institution generated the specific variety of friction that the institution has always produced between women of different institutional seniority, when both women are strong-willed, and the institution has not given either of them an adequate framework for managing the relationship. The Charlotte dress incident is the piece of the Meghan-Kate relationship that the public record has established most firmly, because it is the piece that multiple sources across multiple publications confirmed with sufficient consistency to satisfy the standard of corroborated biographical evidence. A friend of the royal family confirmed to People magazine that there was an argument between Meghan and Kate over the fit of Princess Charlotte's bridesmaid dress at a fitting before the May 2018 wedding, and that Kate had been left in tears by the confrontation. The Telegraph's Camilla Tominey added the specific context that Kate had only recently given birth to Prince Louis and was feeling quite emotional, and that the fittings had been conducted under the pressure of a schedule that left very few sessions for the final adjustments, creating the specific atmosphere of a production running behind in which every decision becomes a conflict and every conflict becomes an injury. The argument was real, the tears were real, both were confirmed by sources whose proximity to the events gave their accounts the weight that proximity provides. What was not real, or what the palace judged insufficiently supported to leave unaddressed, was the version of the Meghan-Kate dynamic that the Sun's Dan Wootton reported in 2018, that Kate had confronted Meghan about her treatment of Kate's staff and had told her that the behavior was unacceptable. Kensington Palace issued the statement that this account has already noted this never happened. The statement was the palace's most direct public intervention in the coverage of the two women's relationship, and its deployment against the Wootton story rather than against the Charlotte dress story is itself a piece of evidence about the palace's assessment of what was accurate and what was not, because the palace does not issue denials of things it judges merely embarrassing. It issues denials of things it judges false, and the statement's existence is the palace's own testimony that the slapdown story was the false version and the tears version was the one it did not need to deny. The Oprah interview of March 2021 reorganized the public understanding of the Kate-Meghan relationship in the manner that Meghan's own testimony reorganizes the understanding of any situation in which the testimony represents the only publicly available first-person account. It established Meghan's version as the version the audience received first and most extensively, and the version's reception organized the subsequent coverage around the question of whether it was accurate, which is a different question from the question of whether it was complete. Meghan said Kate had made her cry before the wedding. The palace sources, briefed to the press in the hours following the broadcast, said the reverse was true. Both versions were covered as the competing claims of a family dispute, and the coverage settled into the permanent irresolution that competing royal claims always produce when neither side will produce the documentation that would resolve them. What the documentation would show, assembled from the biographies whose sourcing this account has drawn on throughout, is the picture of two women in positions of genuine institutional friction, who were managed by the institution in the manner that the institution manages friction between its members, which is the manner of the institution's own interests, rather than the interests of either person. The institution's interest in the friction was the interest of an organization that needed both women to perform their roles effectively and that could not afford the public rupture that the friction's escalation would have produced. The management of the friction toward the private accommodation that the public continuation required was the management that Kate performed with the competence that her formation had built for exactly this kind of sustained pressure over sustained time. And the performance was the reason that the palace's senior staff, in the accounts the biographies drew on, described the Meghan period as the most demanding test of Kate's institutional capacity that the post-wedding years had produced, and described her management of it as the test she passed most completely. The passing of the test produced the Sussex exit of January 2020 and the specific reconfiguration of the institutional landscape that the exit created, and the reconfiguration left Kate in the position that the preceding decade's preparation had been building toward, without the preparation having identified this specific configuration as its destination. The position of the institution's most senior, most trusted, and most capable working female member, with the specific quality of public credibility that the Meghan period's management had produced by contrast. The contrast was not Kate's doing in the sense of being deliberately engineered, but it was Kate's doing in the sense that the specific quality of her management of the period, the public composure, the maintained discretion, the absence of the public rupture that Meghan and Harry had chosen, produced in the audience's reception of both women exactly the contrast that the institution required. The marriage under glass is the phrase that captures the specific condition of William and Kate's relationship across the years that this account has examined, and the phrase requires the two words to be taken separately before they are taken together. The marriage is the private relationship between two people with their own history, their own children, their own accumulated experience of each other across 23 years of continuous proximity. The glass is the institution's requirement that the relationship be performed in public in a specific register, the register of the functional partnership of a future king and queen, whose stability is one of the institution's most significant public assets, and whose instability, should it become publicly visible, is one of the institution's most significant public liabilities. The glass does not prevent the marriage from being a marriage. It prevents the marriage from being a private marriage, which is a different thing, and the prevention is the specific cost that the institution imposes on the people inside its senior relationships. William and Kate have a private marriage in the rooms the cameras do not enter, and they have a public marriage in every room the cameras do enter, and the relationship between the two versions is the relationship that Kate has managed with the formation the preceding 12 parts of this account have assembled, which is the relationship of someone who understands that the two versions must coexist and who has the specific discipline to maintain the public version against the pressure that the private version generates, when the private version contains what the private versions of marriages that are under the pressure of the Norfolk neighbor story and the cancer and the 14 weeks of speculative coverage contain. The Queen, who had conducted her own marriage under glass for 70 years, had specific advice for Kate in the early years of the marriage, and the advice, preserved in the accounts of people who observed the relationship between them, was delivered in the register of a woman who had managed the same condition across a different era's specific pressures and who understood what the management required. The Queen's regard for Kate was described, across the years of the post-wedding relationship, as the specific warmth of someone who recognized in the younger woman the quality she most valued in the institution's members, which was the quality of someone who understood what the role required and provided it without requiring the institution to explain the requirement. The explanation was not required because the formation had provided it, and the formation was the Middleton formation, and the Middleton formation was the product of the kitchen table in 1987 and the Durham coal mines before it, and the Berkshire house between them, and its production was the thing that the institution had found uncomfortable and had discovered was exactly what it needed. What the marriage under glass costs the two people inside it is not fully available in the public record, because the public record is the glass, and the cost is what the glass is managing, and the glass, by definition, does not allow the cost's full visibility. What is available is the evidence of what the management required: the 10-year courtship without institutional protection, the phone call breakup, the ultimatum, the Norfolk neighbor story, the Meghan period, the cancer. Each piece of evidence is a piece of the cost, and the cost assembled across the parts of this account is the cost of a specific exchange, the exchange that Part 14 of this account assesses as honestly as the available evidence permits, which is more honestly than the strategic reading permits, and less honestly than the full private record would permit, and the full private record is the record that the glass prevents. The glass is what Carole built. The marriage inside it is what Kate made. The two things are simultaneously present in every public appearance and every private conversation that this account has not been able to enter, and the simultaneous presence is the condition that the final parts of this account are required to hold without resolving, because honesty about the evidence requires holding it without resolving it, and honesty about the evidence is the only available alternative to the version that the glass produces when it is the only thing the record contains. In January 2025, Kate Middleton stood on a stage in London and delivered a speech about early childhood development to an audience of practitioners and researchers, and the speech was the speech of someone who had returned from something and understood, in the specific way that people understand things they have returned from, what the returning meant. She had completed her course of preventative chemotherapy. She had spent the summer and autumn of 2024 in the managed withdrawal from public duties that the treatment required. She had emerged, in the specific manner of royal returns from medical situations, gradually and carefully, in engagements chosen for their symbolic weight and their manageable demands, and the speech was one of those engagements, and it was also more than those engagements usually are, because the person delivering it was not performing the return. She was simply there, in the way that people who have been through something significant are simply there when they arrive somewhere they have been before, and understand it differently from having been away. The cancer had not changed the platform. The platform had been built across the years this account has traced, through the engagement with the developmental psychology research and the Center for Early Childhood, and the practitioner relationships that Kate had developed from inside the institutional position that the formation had placed her in. What the cancer had changed was the person delivering the platform, in the specific and unquantifiable way that serious illness changes people who survive it, and the change was visible to the people who had known her before the diagnosis and who observed her in the months of the return. They described, in the accounts that reached the coverage of the period, a woman who was the same woman and who was also, in some dimension that the accounts reached for, without fully naming, more fully herself than the version that the preceding years had produced. The more fully herself is the piece of evidence that the strategic reading of the Middleton family cannot accommodate, because the strategic reading is organized around the formation of the performance, and the more fully herself is what exists beneath the performance and independent of it. The Middleton formation, traced across 13 parts of this account, had produced a performer of exceptional competence. What the cancer had disclosed was the person the performance had been performed by, and the person the performance had been performed by was the person who had grown up in the Berkshire house with the mother who screwed the mirror into the furniture shop wall and the father whose grandmother had stood in processions beside Princess Mary, and who had carried both of those things, the Goldsmith working-class formation and the Middleton aristocratic adjacent formation, into the institution that had received her as a complication and kept her as an asset. The honest reckoning of what the kitchen table built requires separating four accountings that the coverage has always run together: what the institution received, what Carole designed, what Kate made of what Carole designed, and what the family paid. The four accountings are different, and running them together has always served the simplest version of the story, which is either the strategic version or the romantic version, and the simplest version is the least accurate. The institution received, across the 14 years between the wedding and the cancer's disclosure, something it had not purchased and had not designed and had not been willing to acknowledge it was receiving while it was receiving it. It received the groundedness of a woman formed outside its walls. It received the emotional intelligence of a family that had spent 3 generations reading rooms it had not been born into. It received the early childhood platform, which is the most significant policy contribution that a senior royal has made to British public life since the early years of the Queen's reign, assembled not from the institution's own resources, but from Kate's independent intellectual engagement with a research field that the institution had not identified as a priority, and that Kate had made a priority through the specific quality of curiosity that the Marlborough and St Andrews formation had developed, and that the institution had never been asked to develop in its own members. It received the specific quality of Kate's management of the Meghan period, which protected the institution from the public rupture that Meghan and Harry's departure might have generated inside the family's visible relationships, and did not generate because Kate managed the period with the specific quality of composure that the formation had built for exactly this kind of sustained pressure. And it received the Garden Statement, which was the most human and the most viewed piece of content that the palace had ever produced, and which generated in the audience that received it a response that no amount of institutional management could have produced, because it was the response to the person rather than to the management of the person, and the person had been made by the kitchen table rather than by the institution. Carole designed a princess. The design was the design this account has documented, from the Durham coal mines to the Edinburgh switch, to the elocution lessons, to the fashion show ticket, to the Berkshire house, to the engagement, to the wedding. The design succeeded in the sense that its primary objective was achieved. Kate became Princess of Wales, and Carole's grandchildren are 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in line to the throne. And the social distance the family travelled in 3 generations is a distance that the English class system does not normally permit to be travelled, and that the Middleton design travelled by understanding the system's specific requirements and meeting them with the specific discipline that the system rewards when the meeting is thorough enough. The design also produced things it had not designed, because designs that operate across decades in contact with human beings produce the human beings rather than the designs, and the human beings depart from the designs in the ways that human beings always depart from the plans made for them. The departure in Kate's case was the departure of a woman who had been formed for a role and who had made something of the role that the formation had not specified. The early childhood work and the Garden Statement and the specific quality of the return from cancer that the practitioners who attended the January 2025 speech described as the presence of someone who understood what she was talking about from the inside rather than from the research alone. The inside understanding was not the design's product, it was Kate's product, made from the specific materials that the cancer and the 14 weeks and the garden had provided, and the making was the departure from the design that no kitchen table in 1987 could have anticipated or produced. What Kate made of what Carole designed is the accounting that the strategic reading most consistently underweights, because the strategic reading is organized around the design's success, and the making is evidence of the person's independence from the design, and the independence is what the strategic reading cannot accommodate without revising the thesis. The thesis is the thesis of the Ruthless family that orchestrated the ascent, and the evidence that Kate brought to the role, something that the orchestration did not produce, requires the thesis to be revised in the direction of something more complicated, which is the direction that the full evidence requires. What the full evidence supports is the account of a woman who was placed, by the design, in a position where her own qualities could operate at a scale the design had identified as the correct scale, and that the qualities justified at a level the design had not anticipated. The early childhood work is the evidence. The Garden Statement is the evidence. The January 2025 speech is the evidence. Each is the product of the position the design secured and the person the design did not make, and the two things, the position and the person, coexisted inside the institution for 14 years and produced between them the outcome that the institution now describes as its most significant asset, which is the assessment of an institution that received what it was given and understood, eventually, what it had. The family paid. The payment is the accounting that the coverage has always found most uncomfortable to conduct, because it requires examining what the design cost the people who were not the design's primary subject, and the people who were not the primary subject are the people this account has examined in the parts devoted to Pippa and James and the party pieces administration and the Gary Goldsmith problem, and the specific variety of public exposure that royal adjacency produces in people who have not been prepared for it, and who pay for the proximity in the currencies of scrutiny and commercial failure, and the specific loss of privacy that the design's success imposed on every member of the family that the design touched. The payment was real. The party pieces administration was the payment of the commercial instrument that funded the design, submitted to the creditor's claims in the year that the design's primary subject was fighting cancer. The Gary Goldsmith problem was the payment of the family member whose distance from the design's values was documented in a News of the World sting operation and managed by the palace in the silence that unresolvable complications receive. The Pippa situation was the payment of the sibling whose proximity to the wedding produced in her a public identity she had not sought, and whose management consumed the years between 2011 and 2017 in the specific direction of the quiet private life that the institution required her to achieve. James's depression was the payment of the family member most exposed to the design's peripheral costs and least protected by the design's primary benefits, who paid the cost of the proximity in the currency of clinical depression and public commercial failure, and the specific quality of purposelessness that being famous for someone else's achievement in a media environment organized around the achievement produces in the person adjacent to it. The net of the four accountings, set against each other without the simplifications that the strategic reading and the romantic reading each require, is the net that this account has been building toward from the fashion show ticket and the front row remark to Fergus Boyd. The institution received more than it paid. Carole designed more than she knew she was designing. Kate made more than the design specified. The family paid more than the coverage acknowledged. These four statements are simultaneously true, and their simultaneous truth is the honest account of what the kitchen table in 1987 actually built, which is not the account that either the doors to manual crowd at Bougie's in 2006 or the romantic glossies that covered the engagement in 2010 were in a position to produce, because both accounts were organized around the portions of the evidence that their respective investments required them to see. The Durham coal seam that John Harrison worked in the 1870s was 4 generations before George, Charlotte, and Louis. The Houghton Hall estate, where Rose Hanbury's husband is the King's Lord-in-Waiting, is 4 miles from Anmere Hall, where William and Kate spend their private time. The distance the family travelled between those 2 points, measured in the currency of the English class system rather than in miles, is the distance that the account has traced across 14 parts, and that the account cannot reduce to a verdict without falsifying the complexity that the evidence produces. The complexity is the honest product of the evidence. The verdict is what the coverage has always preferred to the complexity, and the coverage's preference has always been the evidence's most reliable indicator of what the complexity is protecting. What the complexity is protecting, at the end of this account, is the person who was neither the design's product nor the design's independent creation, but the person who existed at the intersection of the design and her own formation, and the institution's requirements, and the cancer, and the 14 weeks, and the garden, and who arrived, in January 2025, on a stage in London to deliver a speech about early childhood development to an audience of practitioners who had read the research and who found, in the person delivering it, someone who had been through something and understood the subject differently from having been through it. That is what the kitchen table built. Not the princess, though it built that too. The princess was the design's product and the institution's asset and the coverage's story. The person on the stage in January 2025 was the product of all of that and of the things that none of it had designed. The phone call in January 2007, the garden in March 2024, the 14 weeks, the cancer, the return. The return is what no kitchen table in 1987 was working toward, because no kitchen table in 1987 could have worked toward something it had no knowledge was coming. What came was what always comes when a design meets a life, the departure from the design in the direction of the life, and the life's production of something the design had placed in the correct position to be produced but could not, from a kitchen table in Berkshire in 1987, have known it was producing. The kitchen table built the position, the life built the person built the platform and the person who built it are what the kitchen table is now. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.